Chapter 1: The Rotting Glass Sky. Rust wept orange tears down the pitted steel frame of the main gate. Lena Petrova ran a gloved hand over the corroded metal, flakes showering onto the cracked asphalt below. Weeds, thick as ropes, strangled the base of the fence, their tendrils probing the gaps in the chain link like skeletal fingers. Beyond the gate, the Chronos Greenhouse complex sprawled under a perpetually overcast sky, a monument to ambition decaying into ruin. Glass panes, hundreds of them forming the vaulted roofs of the massive biome domes, were missing or shattered, leaving jagged gaps that stared like empty eye sockets. Others were filmed with decades of grime, reflecting the bruised clouds above in dull, distorted patches. The air hung heavy, damp, carrying the scent of wet earth, decay, and something else. A faint, sharp tang, almost metallic, almost ozone. Perimeter security is offline. Looks it, Lena muttered, her voice low and practical. She kicked at a rusted junction box near the gate post. Its cover sprang open, revealing a nest of frayed wires and desiccated insect husks. Power's been down for years, at least out here. She scanned the fence line, her gaze methodical, missing nothing. The fence itself sagged in places, breached by fallen trees or simple neglect. Getting in wouldn't require finesse. Behind her, Dr. Aris Thorne shifted his weight, the gravel crunching under his worn boots. He clutched a ruggedized data tablet against his chest like a shield. His eyes, magnified slightly by his glasses, darted across the decaying facade of the main entrance building, a low-slung concrete structure overshadowed by the nearest towering dome. He swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. "Are you certain this is the best entry point?" The schematics showed auxiliary access tunnels. Lena turned, her expression unreadable. She was compact, efficient in her movements, dressed in durable cargo pants and a weatherproof jacket over a dark base layer. Tools hung unobtrusively from her belt. Auxiliary tunnels are subterranean, prone to flooding, collapse, nesting critters bigger than your head. This gate's rotten. The main doors are probably seized, but the structure is sound. We go through the front door, Doctor. Less chance of breaking an ankle before we even start. She gestured towards a section of the fence where a heavy branch had torn a significant opening. "After you." Aris hesitated, pushing his glasses up his nose. He was taller than Lena, thinner, wearing practical but less rugged outdoor gear that still looked somehow academic. He carried the air of someone profoundly uncomfortable outside a lab or lecture hall. "Right. Of course. Structural integrity." He picked his way through the tangle of weeds and debris towards the gap, moving with a stiff caution that contrasted sharply with Lena's fluid readiness. She followed him through the breach, the sharp ends of broken chain links snagging momentarily on her jacket. Inside the perimeter, the sense of neglect intensified. Paving stones were buckled and displaced by invasive roots. Wild bushes grew untamed, their branches scraping against the grimy walls of the entrance building. A faded sign, barely legible, hung crookedly above the main doors. Chronos Greenhouse Initiative, Cultivating Tomorrow. The optimistic slogan was rendered ironic by the pervasive decay. The main doors were thick, reinforced glass set in heavy steel frames. As Lena predicted, they were locked tight, likely seized by rust and time. She examined the edges, the lock mechanism. Standard magnetic lock overridden by a keycard system. Power's dead, so the mags are dormant, but the physical bolt. She produced a slender pry bar from her belt. "Give me space." Aris stepped back, watching nervously as Lena wedged the tip of the bar into the seam between the doors. She braced herself, planting her feet wide. With a controlled grunt of effort, she applied pressure. Metal groaned in protest. Rust flaked away. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She repositioned the bar, applied pressure again. A sharp crack resonated, not glass, but the bolt mechanism giving way. The door shuddered inwards a few inches, releasing a puff of stale, confined air. It smelled worse in here, damp, mildewed, with that same underlying chemical sharpness. "Okay," Lena said, breathing a little harder. She pulled the door open wider, revealing a dark interior. "Entry achieved. Stay alert." Aris nodded, gripping his tablet tighter. "Understood. Alert." He peered into the gloom beyond the doorway. Lena retrieved a powerful flashlight from her belt, its beam cutting a clean white cone through the darkness. She swept it across the lobby. Dust motes danced in the beam like frantic insects. The reception desk stood opposite the entrance, its surface littered with yellowed papers, overturned coffee mugs stained with ancient residue, and a surprising amount of fine gray dust. Behind it, a bank of monitors was dark, cracked screens reflecting the flashlight beam emptily. Chairs lay on their sides. Filing cabinet drawers hung open, spilling their contents onto the stained carpet. Everything spoke of a sudden, chaotic departure. "Place went down hard," Lena observed, her light tracking across the debris. She nudged a pile of papers with her boot. Personnel files, research proposals, mundane office memos, all coated in the same uniform layer of grime. No obvious signs of violence, though, not conventional violence. Aris stepped inside, his initial reluctance overcome by a researcher's curiosity. He shone his own weaker flashlight beam around. The project was officially shut down following an incident. Containment failure in biome Gamma. That's the official story anyway. He moved towards the reception desk, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. "My access codes were revoked shortly after. They classified everything." "Incident," Lena repeated flatly. Cute word for whatever emptied this place out. Her beam paused on something near the far wall, a large potted plant, or what remained of it. It was completely desiccated, brown and brittle, yet oddly intact. No signs of insect damage, no shedding leaves. It looked like it had been flash-dried. She moved closer, her light tracing its structure. Beside it, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small, child-sized rubber boot, similarly coated in dust. Oddly out of place in a high-tech research facility lobby. She made no comment, sweeping her light onwards. Aris found a bank of elevators, doors closed tight. An adjacent stairwell door was slightly ajar. "Stairs look viable," he said. "According to the blueprints, central control should be on level 2. If any part of the internal network is functional, we might be able to access it from there. I need to find the primary data archive." "Lead the way, Doctor," Lena said, falling in behind him. "Keep that light moving." The stairwell echoed with their footsteps. Concrete steps were gritty underfoot. The air grew cooler, damper, the metallic tang strengthening. Water stains marked the walls in complex patterns, and in places, a strange, almost crystalline residue glittered faintly where moisture had collected and evaporated over the years. It wasn't salt. Aris stopped to scrape a tiny sample into a collection vial from his kit, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" Lena asked, watching the stairwell landings above and below. "Unsure, some kind of silicate deposit maybe, unusual crystalline structure, wasn't present during initial construction surveys." He sealed the vial carefully. The temporal fields, they might have had unforeseen environmental effects, geochemical interactions. Unforeseen effects seem to be the theme here, Lena replied dryly. They continued upward. Level 2 opened onto a corridor, wider than the stairwell, lined with office doors and laboratory entrances. Most were closed. Emergency lighting fixtures hung crookedly from the ceiling, their plastic covers yellowed and cracked. Here, the signs of abrupt departure were even more pronounced. A spilled briefcase lay open, its contents scattered. A whiteboard still bore equations and frantic-looking diagrams, partially erased in smeared streaks. The silence was deeper here, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere unseen. Aris consulted his tablet, overlaying the facility map. Central control should be this way. He pointed down the left fork of the corridor. Lena swept her beam in that direction. The corridor stretched perhaps 50 meters before ending in a set of heavy-looking double doors marked Central Control Authorized Personnel Only. Along the walls, occasional vents were rusted, some bent outwards as if something had pushed through from inside. Strange, fibrous growths, like pale, unhealthy roots, emerged from cracks between floor tiles and wall panels in places. They looked disturbingly organic, yet somehow unnatural in this sterile environment. As they moved forward, Lena's light snagged on something near one of the vents. Tracks, not human footprints, three-toed, clawed impressions pressed into the thick layer of dust, larger than any bird she knew, sharply defined. Relatively fresh, the dust wasn't completely resettled within them. She motioned silently with her light. Aris saw them. He paled slightly. "Raptorial," he whispered, crouching to examine them closer without touching. But the scale. There were avian test subjects, developmental studies in biome delta, the accelerated zone, but nothing this large was ever documented. "Documented," Lena echoed, "means nothing now." She scanned the corridor ahead, her hand resting near the heavy multi-tool on her belt, which included a sturdy blade. Something sizable is, or was, down here. They continued towards central control, moving more cautiously now, their flashlights probing every shadow, every alcove, every damaged vent cover. The dripping sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking. Aris reached the double doors first. A keycard scanner panel was mounted beside them, dark and lifeless. Below it, a manual release wheel crusted with rust. "This should bypass the electronic lock," Aris said, grasping the wheel. It resisted, frozen solid. Lena stepped up. "Let me." She applied penetrating oil from a small canister on her belt, letting it soak in before gripping the wheel with both gloved hands. She strained, muscles cording in her arms. With a tortured screech of protesting metal, the wheel began to turn, inch by agonizing inch. The clicking sound from down the corridor seemed to pause, then resume, slightly faster. "Almost there," Lena grunted, putting her shoulder into it. The wheel completed its rotation with a final groan. A heavy clunk echoed from within the door mechanism. It was unlocked. Aris reached for the handle. Before his fingers could touch it, a high-pitched, chittering screech erupted from further down the corridor, the direction they had come from. It wasn't the clicking sound. This was sharp, predatory, and closer than expected. Lena spun, raising her flashlight beam. Something moved fast at the edge of the light, vanishing into an open office doorway 50 meters back. It was low to the ground, impossibly quick, a blur of motion that her eyes barely registered. Not the source of the clicking, but something else. Inside. Now, Lena ordered, pushing Aris towards the control room doors. He scrambled to obey, fumbling with the heavy door handle. It swung inwards into darkness. He stumbled inside. Lena backed in after him, her flashlight beam still trained down the corridor, sweeping back and forth. The clicking sound had stopped entirely. The corridor was silent again, but the silence felt charged, watchful. She pulled the heavy door shut behind them. It closed with a solid, echoing thud, plunging them into absolute blackness before Aris fumbled his own light back on. They were in, but the feeling of being watched, of having narrowly avoided something, lingered heavily in the stale air. The central control room was large, arranged in concentric tiers facing a vast, dark view screen that probably once displayed data from all the biomes. Consoles sat silent, covered in dust. Emergency power lights provided a bare minimum of gloomy red illumination here and there, casting long, distorted shadows. "Okay," Aris breathed, his voice shaky. "Okay, we made it to control. Now, let's see if anything still works." He moved towards the main command console at the center of the top tier, his tablet already displaying diagnostic tools. Lena didn't relax. She swept her beam around the control room itself. Multiple doors led off from the main space, maintenance access, server rooms, perhaps another exit. Were they truly secure in here? Her light lingered on a section of the floor near a darkened server bank. More of those strange, root-like growths emerged from hairline cracks in the tiles. And nestled amongst them, almost camouflaged, were several small, slug-like shapes, pulsing faintly with a sickly internal light. They were about the size of her thumb, glistening wetly. Temporal leeches, maybe. One of the horrors whispered about in the fragmented, leaked reports Aris had shown her. Before she could point them out, Aris let out a low gasp. "Lena, look at this." She turned her beam towards him. He had managed to power up a small auxiliary screen on the main console. It flickered erratically, displaying corrupted text and error messages. But one log entry was partially legible, time-stamped just moments before the facility officially went dark years ago. Log C biome gamma containment breach T-field cascade imminent subject PRIMUS protocol active, behavior deviant, aggression levels unprecedented. Oh God, it's loose. It remembers. It REMEMBERS the doors. The rest of the message dissolved into digital noise. Subject Primus, Lena asked, keeping her voice low. "Another one of your undocumented successes, Doctor." Aris looked grim. Primus wasn't an animal. He was head of security, ex-military. They were testing personnel resilience in the temporal fields, particularly the regressive field in Gamma. His eyes met hers, wide with dawning horror. If that protocol activated, if he devolved but retained tactical knowledge. A heavy, rhythmic thump suddenly reverberated through the control room door they had just entered. Slow, deliberate, powerful, followed by another thump. Whatever was outside wasn't trying to be subtle. It knew they were here, and it knew how to open doors. Thump, the metal door visibly buckled inward slightly with the impact. Rust particles showered down from the frame. Lena raised her flashlight beam towards the door, her other hand moving to the heaviest tool on her belt. Eris stared, frozen, the fragmented log entry glowing like a malevolent prophecy on the console screen. The vast, dark control room suddenly felt terrifyingly small, a trap closing around them. Thump. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Code. Thump. The heavy control room door vibrated again, the metal groaning around the locking points. Dust sifted from the ceiling tiles above the frame. Lena didn't flinch, her flashlight beam fixed unwaveringly on the shuddering barrier. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the heavy multi-tool. Beside her, Eris had backed away from the console, his face pale in the dim red emergency lighting and the spill from his own flashlight, which trembled slightly in his hand. Can it get through?" Eris whispered, his voice tight with fear. The sound was unnervingly small in the large, tiered room. Lena assessed the door critically. Thick steel, reinforced frame set deep into concrete. The manual wheel lock was internal, hopefully robust, but the hinges looked strained, bolts potentially weakened by years of damp and neglect. And the impacts, they weren't frantic. They were measured, powerful, exploratory, testing for weakness. "It's testing the door," she stated, her voice low and steady. "Heavy impacts. It knows this is a strong point." She shifted her stance slightly, positioning herself between Eris and the door, though the gesture felt pitifully inadequate against the sheer force hinted at by the blows. Thump, a distinct dent appeared in the door's surface, pushed outwards from the corridor side. A spiderweb of cracks radiated across the grimy paint. Okay, Eris stammered, forcing himself back towards the console. "Data. We need options. Another way out. Security overrides." His fingers flew across the auxiliary screen he'd partially activated, ignoring the cascade of error messages, searching for command prompts, anything functional within the corrupted system. The console flickered, emitting a low hum that seemed unnaturally loud against the backdrop of the assault on the door. Lena kept her attention divided. The door, the room's other potential entrances or weak points, the sounds from the corridor. The rhythmic clicking they'd heard earlier was absent now, replaced by the singular, brutal focus of the impacts. She swept her light across the other doors leading off central control. One marked server room looked promisingly solid. Another, labeled Maintenance Access B, appeared less robust, possibly leading to ventilation shafts or utility crawl spaces. A third, unmarked, stood near the back wall. Too many unknowns. Her light passed again over the cluster of slug-like shapes near the server bank. The temporal leeches. Were they reacting to the vibrations, to their proximity? One of them seemed to swell slightly, its internal luminescence brightening for a moment before dimming again. She made a mental note, avoid that corner. Crunch, a sickening sound of stressed metal. the door handle on their side visibly deformed. A thin sliver of darkness appeared along the top edge of the door as it warped slightly in its frame. "It's making progress," Lena said, her voice hardening. "Doctor, find something useful now." "I'm trying," Aris snapped back, his fear momentarily overridden by frustration. He stabbed at the flickering screen. "The core systems are fried, decades of decay, power surges during the shutdown. It's a miracle anything boots at all. I'm accessing fragmented memory caches, directory remnants." Text scrolled rapidly, mostly gibberish, corrupted file names, system warnings. "Wait, schematics, partial, facility level 2. An architectural diagram flickered onto the screen, lines broken, sections missing but recognizable. It showed central control and the surrounding corridors. Crucially, it depicted another potential exit. "Here," Aris pointed a trembling finger. "That unmarked door leads to a service corridor, runs parallel to the main hallway, connects to Section Theta maintenance hub." Lena glanced at the unmarked door at the back. Solid construction, similar to the main entrance. Another wheel lock mechanism was visible. "Theta hub, what's there?" "It housed environmental controls for biomes Delta and Epsilon," Aris explained, still scrolling through fragmented data. "Delta was accelerated time, avian development, insect evolution studies, raptors." His voice dropped. "Epsilon was slower time, long-term botanical studies. That's where the gardeners originated, the Viridian kin staff trapped there." He found another snippet of text. "Log fragment, security patrol, Theta hub, unidentified avian aggression. Overwhelming speed, sealing access." He looked up, his eyes grim. "The hub connects to ventilation shafts leading towards Delta. It sounds like the raptors might have broken containment into that area too." "So, trade the devolved security chief pounding on the door for hyper-evolved killer birds," Lena summarized flatly. "Choices." SCRECH. Metal tore. A jagged rip appeared near the damaged handle of the main door. A thick, grimy finger, unnaturally jointed, inhumanly strong, poked through the gap, retracting instantly. "Time's up," Lena said decisively. "We go for the service corridor. Get whatever data you can download onto that tablet fast." She moved towards the unmarked door, examining the wheel lock. It looked as rusted and seized as the first one. She pulled out her pry bar and penetrating oil again. Aris frantically tapped commands, initiating a data transfer of the fragmented logs and schematics to his ruggedized tablet. A progress bar crawled across the small screen. "It's slow. The connection is unstable." Lena ignored him, focusing on the wheel lock. She applied the oil, let it sit for a precious few seconds, then braced herself and heaved. Rust resisted. Metal groaned. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. The sounds from the main door were intensifying, scraping, tearing, punctuated by furious grunts that were disturbingly close to human, yet fundamentally wrong. "Come on," Lena muttered through gritted teeth, throwing her weight into the effort. The wheel gave slightly, screeching in protest. She repositioned her grip, heaved again. It turned another agonizing inch. Behind her, Aris gave a choked cry. "Lena, the leeches." Lena risked a glance back. The temporal leeches near the server bank were active. Several had detached themselves from the floor and were inching across the tiles towards Aris and the console, drawn perhaps by the localized energy field of the active screen or his biosignature. They moved with a slow, deliberate crawl, leaving glistening trails. Their internal light pulsed rhythmically, sickeningly. One was barely a meter from Aris's foot. He scrambled backwards, stumbling over a loose cable. "Ignore them. Keep the data transfer running," Lena ordered, refocusing her efforts on the wheel. She couldn't afford distractions. The main door sounded like it was seconds from collapsing entirely. A loud bang signaled a locking bolt finally shearing off. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Lena wrenched the wheel through its full rotation. A heavy clunk echoed from the service door's mechanism. It was unlocked. She grabbed the handle, pulling it open just as Aris yelled, "Transfer complete." "Go," Lena shoved him towards the newly opened doorway. It revealed a narrow, dark corridor, thick with dust and cobwebs. Aris scrambled through, clutching his tablet. Lena backed in after him, her flashlight beam still playing on the main control room. A leech had reached the console Aris had abandoned, crawling onto the keyboard. Where it touched, the plastic seemed to shimmer and distort, aging rapidly, becoming brittle and cracked in seconds. In the main doorway, a massive, shadowy shape blocked the opening, silhouetted against the faint light from the outer corridor. Subject Primus. It paused, head cocked, sensing their escape. Lena slammed the service door shut. She spun the wheel lock frantically from their side, praying it would hold better than the main one. It spun more easily now, seating with a reassuring thud. Safe, for now, maybe. They stood in utter darkness for a moment, chests heaving, listening. No immediate sounds of pursuit, just the frantic thumping of their own hearts and the thick, muffling silence of the narrow service corridor. Lena clicked her flashlight back on. The beam illuminated a cramped passage, barely wide enough for them to stand shoulder to shoulder. Pipes lined one wall, coated in dust and strange crystalline growths similar to those in the stairwell. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay and ozone. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from the ceiling and walls. "Okay," Lena breathed out, trying to regain control. "Report. What did you get?" Aris consulted his tablet, its screen providing a pool of ghostly light. "The schematics are corrupted, but show this corridor runs the length of this wing. It bypasses the main labs where Primus seems to be concentrating. Multiple access points, mostly maintenance hatches into labs or ventilation systems. And yes, it terminates at the Theta maintenance hub." He zoomed in on a flickering section of the map. Theta hub connects directly to primary ventilation shafts V7 and V8. V7 services Biome Delta Raptor territory. V8 services Biome Epsilon Viridian Kin territory. There's also something else. He pointed to a small, unlabeled room adjacent to the hub on the schematic. "No data on this section. Classified above my original clearance, or the data is totally corrupted." "Great, more unknowns," Lena muttered. She started moving cautiously down the service corridor, sweeping her light ahead. The floor was concrete, littered with debris, fallen insulation, rusted tools, unidentifiable dried organic matter. Every few meters, a caged utility light fixture hung from the ceiling, long dead. "There's more," Aris said, following closely behind her. Log fragments from security teams just before the shutdown, mentions of erratic movement patterns from Delta's primary test subjects, increased aggression, unexpected adaptability. He scrolled further. And this, subject designation Maz Jayan, civilian researcher, psychology division, unauthorized entry into biome gamma shortly before containment failure, status, unknown, presumed lost. Lena stopped. Maz Jayan, wasn't he the one obsessed with the temporal field's psychological effects? Rumors where he thought he could achieve some kind of accelerated enlightenment. The same, Aris confirmed grimly. If he survived Gamma's regressive field, what would he be now, and where? A faint scraping sound echoed from ahead, deeper within the service corridor. It was soft, furtive, quickly silenced. Animal or something else? Lena held up a hand, signaling silence. They both strained their ears, flashlights off to preserve night vision and avoid attracting attention. The corridor was pitch black, the silence absolute except for the distant, almost subliminal hum of whatever residual power kept the emergency lights in control flickering. After a minute, the scraping didn't resume. Could be rats, Aris whispered uncertainly, or settling. Or something doesn't want us to hear it, Lena countered quietly. She switched her light back on, keeping the beam low. Let's move. Theta Hub is our best bet for now. Maybe we can seal the connecting vents, find another route from there. They pressed on, the narrow confines of the corridor feeling increasingly claustrophobic. The silence stretched, broken only by the crunch of debris under their boots and their own breathing. Lena noticed more of the three-toed raptor tracks in the thicker patches of dust here, some overlapping older, larger prints that might have belonged to Primus during his earlier patrols. The ecosystems were definitely overlapping, bleeding into these interstitial spaces. After about 10 minutes of slow, cautious progress, the corridor began to widen slightly. Ahead, Lena's beam illuminated a junction. The service corridor continued straight, but a heavy steel hatchway, like an airlock door, was set into the right-hand wall. It was unmarked, matching the location of the classified room on Aris's schematic. The hatch was dogged shut with heavy clamps. "That's the mystery room," Aris murmured, shining his light on the hatch. "Think we should check it out. Could be supplies, equipment." Lena examined the clamps. They were tight, showing no signs of recent tampering. Could be anything, could be why it was classified, could be full of whatever they didn't want anyone finding. She shook her head. "No, we stick to the plan. Theta Hub. Getting sidetracked is how people die in places like this." They continued past the hatch, heading towards the end of the corridor. The air quality worsened, the metallic tang becoming sharper, mixed with a dry, dusty scent like old feathers and reptile musk. Sounds began to filter through, distant clicks, a low chittering sound that echoed strangely, and occasionally a deeper, guttural rustling that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The corridor ended abruptly at another heavy door, this one bearing the faded label Theta Maintenance Hub Authorized Personnel. Unlike the others, this door stood slightly ajar, darkness pooling in the gap. The sounds, the clicking, the chittering were louder here, clearly emanating from beyond the door. Lena pushed it open cautiously. It swung inward smoothly, silently. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a large, high-ceiling chamber. Catwalks crisscrossed the upper levels, leading to massive ventilation duct junctions marked V7 and V8. Control consoles lined one wall, mostly dark, though a few status lights blinked erratically. Pipes and conduits snaked across the walls and ceiling. The floor was littered with debris, overturned equipment, and bones. Small animal bones, mostly, picked clean, scattered amongst dried scraps of nesting material, shredded insulation, fabric, wiring. And perched silently on the catwalk directly above them, almost invisible against the dark metal, were two shapes. Featherless, scaled bodies held low, heads cocked with predatory intelligence. Sharp, serrated beaks pointed downwards. Unblinking reptilian eyes reflected Lena's flashlight beam with unnerving intensity. Hyper-raptors. They hadn't been heard, hadn't made a sound. They were just watching, waiting. One of them opened its beak slightly, emitting a series of rapid, high-frequency clicks, barely audible to human ears but clearly a signal. From deeper within the cavernous hub, more clicking sounds answered. They weren't alone. Lena slowly lowered her flashlight beam, trying not to make any sudden movements. Aris stood frozen beside her, his breath catching in his throat. They had walked directly into the raptor's den. The escape route had become the hunting ground. Chapter 3: The Clicking Descent. Silence stretched taut in the Theta maintenance hub, thick and heavy as the dust coating every surface. Lena's flashlight beam remained fixed on the two hyper-raptors perched motionless on the catwalk above. Their eyes, lidless and obsidian black, seemed to absorb the light, reflecting nothing but cold, predatory focus. The only sounds were the faint, erratic blinking of dormant console lights, the distant hum of failing machinery, and Aris's shallow, rapid breaths beside her. The high-frequency clicking had ceased, leaving an expectant stillness that felt far more dangerous. "Don't move," Lena breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her body language non-threatening, lowering the flashlight beam slightly so it illuminated the floor between them and the raptors, rather than blinding them directly. Sudden movements, direct challenges, those were triggers for predators. They're assessing us, deciding if we're prey or threat. Aris swallowed hard, his gaze flicking nervously between the raptors above and the shadowed corners of the vast chamber. They learn fast," he whispered back, recalling the fragmented log entries. "Adaptable, coordinated." He scanned the consoles lining the far wall. "If I could reach those terminals, maybe initiate a purge cycle in the V7 duct, flush them out, or at least distract them." Too far, Lena judged instantly. The consoles were a good 20 meters away, across an open floor littered with debris perfect for tripping hazards. Getting there would mean exposing themselves completely. "Cover, we need immediate cover." Her eyes darted around the hub. Overturned machinery lay scattered like forgotten metal beasts. A small, glass-walled control booth stood near the consoles, its door hanging open, glass shattered. Two exposed. Heavy pipes ran along the base of the wall's minimal cover. Then she saw it. A cluster of large, cylindrical filter housings near the base of the massive V8 ventilation duct junction. Thick metal, bolted to the floor, offering a solid barrier if they could reach it. It was closer than the consoles, maybe 10 meters to their right. More clicking sounds echoed softly, seeming to come from multiple directions now, the catwalks above. The gaping maw of the V7 ducked to their left, the shadowed areas beneath the raised platforms. They weren't just facing two raptors, they were surrounded. The initial pair were scouts, sentinels. One of the raptors on the catwalk shifted its weight almost imperceptibly. Its head tilted, bird-like, yet utterly alien. Its serrated beak opened slightly, emitting a low hiss that cut through the silence. "Move now, to the right." "Smoothly," Lena commanded, taking a slow, deliberate step sideways towards the filter housings. She didn't turn her back on the raptors above, keeping them in her peripheral vision. Aris hesitated for a fraction of a second, then mirrored her movement, his steps crunching too loudly on the debris-strewn floor. The reaction was instantaneous. The hiss sharpened into a piercing shriek. From the catwalks, from the shadows, raptors erupted into motion. They didn't fly, not truly, but launched themselves in gliding leaps, rudimentary wing stubs catching the air just enough to control their descent. Others scrambled down support struts with terrifying agility, claws finding purchase on corroded metal. They moved with a fluid, reptilian grace married to blinding speed. "Run!" Lena yelled, abandoning stealth. She shoved Aris forward towards the filter housings while simultaneously swinging her flashlight beam upwards, directly into the eyes of the nearest descending raptor. The creature shrieked again, momentarily disoriented by the sudden glare, its trajectory faltering. They scrambled the remaining distance, Aris stumbling, Lena grabbing his arm to keep him upright. Raptors landed around them, claws scraping on concrete, their clicking calls rising to a frenzy. One darted in from the side, jaws snapping, aiming for Aris's leg. Lena lashed out with her heavy multi-tool, the sturdy blade extended. It connected with the raptor's flank, not a deep cut against its tough hide, but enough to make it recoil with a startled squawk. They reached the filter housings, ducking behind the largest cylinder just as another raptor sailed past where they had been moments before, crashing into a stack of discarded conduits. Lena pressed herself against the cool metal, heart pounding, peering around the edge. Aris huddled beside her, breathing in ragged gasps, clutching his tablet like a talisman. At least 6 raptors were visible now on the main floor, circling their position cautiously, heads low, long tails whipping back and forth. More were likely still on the catwalks, observing, coordinating. The clicking was constant, a complex, layered communication she couldn't begin to decipher. They weren't attacking recklessly. They were probing, testing, surrounding. "Status report, Doctor," Lena snapped, needing information, needing focus. "Anything useful on that tablet?" Aris fumbled with the device, his fingers slick with sweat. "Schematics," hub layout confirmed. "Filter housings are part of the primary intake for V8, Epsilon biome, air scrubbers." He zoomed in, tracing lines. "Power conduits run beneath the floor, grating near the main consoles. High voltage, potentially unstable." He looked up, eyes wide. "Maybe overload them, create an arc." "Risky," Lena countered. "Could knock out what little power is left, plunge us into total darkness, and we'd have to cross open ground to get there." She scanned their surroundings again. The raptors were spreading out, some moving towards the V7 duct opening, others towards the consoles, cutting off potential escape routes. One particularly large specimen, its scales darker, almost black, seemed to be directing the others with sharp clicks and head movements. The alpha. Suddenly, a different sound intruded, a low, resonant hum, seemingly coming from the massive V8 duct behind them. It was accompanied by a faint, sweet, cloying scent drifting from the filter housing seams. Not decay, not ozone. Something organic, floral, but unnervingly heavy. Aris sniffed the air. Pheromones. Epsilon Flora analysis mentioned complex airborne signaling compounds. Could be the Viridian kin. Are they aware of us? Or the raptors? The raptors reacted to the scent too. Several paused, heads lifting, sniffing the air uncertainly. The alpha let out a series of sharp, interrogative clicks directed towards the V8 duct. No response came, only the steady, low hum and the thickening floral scent. Lena saw an opportunity in the momentary distraction. The consoles. High-voltage conduit access panel should be at the base. If you can trigger an overload, I can cover you. It might be enough chaos to break through. Aris looked terrified but nodded grimly. Okay, give me a signal. Lena took a deep breath. She scanned the raptors' positions. The alpha was focused on V8. 2 were near the consoles. 3 more were circling their position. Now, she yelled. She burst from behind the filter housing, charging directly towards the 2 raptors near the consoles. She didn't aim to engage them directly, but to drive them back, create space for Aris. She shone her flashlight beam erratically, waved her arms, yelled. It was pure bluff, relying on surprise and mammalian unpredictability against reptilian calculation. The 2 raptors near the consoles recoiled, startled by the sudden, aggressive display. Aris scrambled out from behind the filters, sprinting low across the open floor towards the control panel base. The alpha raptor reacted instantly, abandoning its scrutiny of V8. It let out a piercing command shriek. The 3 circling raptors shot towards Lena like scaled missiles. Simultaneously, the 2 she had startled recovered, turning back towards the fleeing Aris. Lena met the charge. She sidestepped the first raptor's snapping jaws, swinging the heavy multi-tool in a wide arc. It glanced off the creature's skull with a dull thud, making it stumble. The second one lunged, claws extended. Lena dropped low, letting it sail over her, its talons scraping sparks off the concrete where she'd been. The third one circled, trying to flank her. She kept moving, using the scattered debris as obstacles, trying to keep them from surrounding her completely. Meanwhile, Aris reached the base of the main console bank. He frantically searched for the access panel described on the schematic. The 2 raptors he'd drawn were closing in fast, ignoring Lena, focused on the easier prey. Aris, Lena shouted, fending off another lunge. He found it, a heavy metal plate bolted to the floor. He dropped to his knees, tablet forgotten for the moment, wrestling with the rusted retaining bolts. One snapped off. He strained at the other. A raptor shrieked almost upon him. Suddenly, a section of the metal grating near Aris shimmered. A fine, almost invisible web, strung between the console base and a fallen stanchion, pulsed with faint bioluminescence. The lead raptor, rushing towards Aris, blundered straight into it. The effect was immediate. The raptor convulsed violently, limbs spasming. Its shrieks turned guttural, choked. Its movements became erratic, uncoordinated. Faint electrical sparks crackled around its body where it contacted the shimmering threads. A neural weaver web, hidden, waiting. The second raptor heading for Ares skidded to a halt, confused and alarmed by its packmate's distress. It backed away slowly, clicking nervously. Ares stared in horror for a split second before realizing his chance. He gave the remaining bolt a final, desperate twist. It sheared off. He ripped the panel cover away, revealing a tangle of thick, insulated cables and junction boxes beneath the floor. Sparks jumped erratically from a cracked insulator. "Now what?" he yelled back at Lena, who was still dancing with the other three raptors near the center of the hub. "The tablet, find the primary breaker or shunt control, divert power." Lena ducked under a snapping beak, kicking outwards to create space. The Alpha was closing in, more cautious than the others, but infinitely more dangerous. Ares grabbed his tablet, shielding it with his body as he frantically searched the corrupted interface for the relevant command. Error messages flashed. Access denied. He tried brute-forcing override codes mentioned in the logs. The raptor caught in the neural weaver web finally collapsed, twitching feebly. From the shadows beneath the catwalk near the web, something stirred. Multiple pairs of small, glowing eyes appeared. The weavers themselves. The floral scent from V8 intensified, becoming almost suffocatingly sweet. A low, guttural chanting sound began to emanate from the duct now, rhythmic and unsettling. It wasn't human language, but it had cadence, intention. The Veridian kin were awake and aware. The Alpha Raptor seemed torn, its attention flickering between Lena, the downed packmate near the weaver web, Ares at the console, and the growing strangeness from V8. It let out a frustrated screech. "Found it," Ares yelled. "Emergency power divert protocol. Warning. May cause catastrophic system failure." "Do it," Lena screamed, as the Alpha finally committed, lunging towards her with incredible speed. Ares slammed his finger onto the flickering icon on his tablet screen. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening whoomp, the lights in the hub flared violently, bathing everything in harsh, actinic glare. Blue electrical arcs erupted from the open panel at Ares's feet, crawling up the console bank, setting dust and debris alight. The air filled with the smell of ozone and burning insulation. The raptors shrieked in pain and confusion, blinded by the flash and deafened by the noise. The Alpha, momentarily halted in its lunge towards Lena, shook its head violently. The main lights died as quickly as they had flared, plunging the hub into near-total darkness, save for the flickering fires Ares had started near the console, the residual glow of the neural weaver web, the pulsing of the temporal leeches Lena had spotted earlier near the distant server bank, which seemed agitated by the power surge, and the faint, sweet-smelling bioluminescence now starting to seep from the V8 duct opening. Lena used the chaos. She scrambled away from the disoriented Alpha, heading back towards Ares and the relative safety of the V8 filter housings. She grabbed his arm as she passed. "Come on, move." Ares stumbled after her, coughing from the acrid smoke. The raptors were screeching, disoriented, some crashing into obstacles in the sudden darkness. But they wouldn't stay confused for long. They reached the filters again, pressing themselves behind the metal cylinders. The fires near the console provided flickering, unreliable illumination, casting monstrous shadows that danced with the residual flashes from the overloaded circuits. The raptors' shrieks were slowly turning back into coordinated clicks as they regrouped. But now there were other sounds. The chanting from V8 was louder, closer, accompanied by a heavy rustling from within the vast duct, and from the direction of the service corridor they'd entered through, a heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 louder than before, echoing into the hub. Primus had followed them, and the door wouldn't hold him for long. "We're trapped," Aris stated, his voice hollow with despair. "Raptors in front, kin behind, Primus coming up the rear." Lena scanned the chaotic scene. The neural weavers were cautiously emerging, scuttling towards their paralyzed victim. The temporal leeches seemed to be migrating slowly across the floor towards the energy fluctuations near the console. The raptors were reforming their lines. The chanting from V8 pulsed like a feverish heartbeat. "Not trapped," Lena corrected, her mind racing. "We have options, bad options, but options." She pointed towards the gaping V7 duct mouth, the source of the raptors. Back into the heart of their territory, suicide. She gestured towards the service corridor. "Face Primus, not without better weapons." She looked at the V8 duct where the chanting swelled and the sweet-smelling luminescence pulsed. "Or we take our chances with the gardeners." The rhythmic thumping from the service corridor door intensified into a furious barrage. Metal screamed in protest. "Decision time, Doctor," Lena said grimly, pulling a climbing rope and grappling hook from her pack. The V8 duct opening was 20 feet up the wall, accessible via a maintenance ladder near the filter housings. "Are you ready to meet the neighbors?" Chapter 4: The Verdant Maw. The tortured screech of metal giving way ripped through the chaotic symphony of the Theta maintenance hub. With a final, catastrophic crunch, the service corridor door burst inwards, torn nearly off its hinges. Framed in the jagged opening, silhouetted against the gloom behind him, stood Subject Primus. He was immense. Far larger than a normal human, his frame thickened, distorted by the regressive temporal field he'd marinated in. His posture was a stooped caricature of humanity, knuckles almost brushing the debris-strewn floor. Remnants of a black security uniform clung to his warped physique in tattered shreds, strained over unnatural musculature. Sections of what looked like integrated body armor plating were fused directly into his toughened, leathery hide, cracked and scored but still offering protection. His head was low-slung, jaw prognathous, brow heavy, yet beneath the devolved features, a disturbing spark of tactical awareness glittered in his deep-set eyes. He scanned the hub, taking in the flickering fires, the screeching raptors, the humans huddled near the V8 duct, his gaze lingering perhaps a fraction longer on Lena and Aris. He held no conventional weapon, but his hands, massive and claw-tipped, flexed and unflexed, capable of tearing steel. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated in the chest cavity, less animalistic roar than a declaration of territorial dominance. The nearest hyper-raptors reacted instantly to this new, massive threat. Two of them, positioned between Primus and the humans, swiveled their heads, emitting sharp, challenging clicks. They lowered their bodies, preparing to defend their hunting ground. Primus ignored them for a moment, his attention fixed on Lena and Aris scrambling towards the maintenance ladder leading up to the V8 duct opening. Easier prey first. Tactical priority. Climb, Lena snapped, shoving Aris towards the rusted metal rungs bolted into the wall beside the filter housings. Don't look down, don't stop. She unslung the grappling hook and rope, checking the knot with practiced efficiency even as Primus began to move, lumbering into the hub with surprising speed for his bulk. He swatted aside a smaller raptor that darted too close, sending it tumbling end over end with a contemptuous grunt. The other raptors screeched, momentarily confused by the infighting, their pack discipline faltering in the face of this brute force intrusion. Aris slapped his hand onto the first rung. It was cold, damp, coated in rust that flaked off under his grip. He pulled himself up, his movements clumsy with fear but driven by sheer adrenaline. Lena holstered the multi-tool, securing the rope, ready to follow or provide cover. Primus closed the distance, crossing the hub floor with heavy, ground-shaking strides. He bypassed the ongoing raptor chaos near the consoles, his path direct towards the V8 ladder. The Alpha Raptor, momentarily distracted from Lena by the power surge and now by Primus, let out a piercing shriek, rallying its pack. Three raptors broke off from harassing the humans and launched themselves at Primus's flank. They hit him like scaled bullets. Jaws snapped, claws raked. Primus roared, a sound of fury and pain staggering slightly. He backhanded one raptor away, grabbed another by the neck with terrifying strength and slammed it bodily into the concrete floor with a sickening crunch. Bones broke. The creature lay twitching, its clicks turning into faint, agonized chirps. The third raptor latched onto his back, sinking its teeth into the thick hide between armor plates. Primus bellowed again, reaching back blindly, trying to dislodge it. This brief, brutal engagement bought Lena and Aris precious seconds. Aris was already 5 meters up the ladder, scrambling frantically. Lena planted her foot on the bottom rung, starting her own ascent, her eyes flicking between Aris above, the struggling Primus below, and the remaining raptors who were now torn between attacking the preoccupied behemoth and the escaping humans. Almost there, Aris called down, his voice strained. He reached the level of the V8 duct opening, a dark, arching maw in the concrete wall some 20 feet above the floor. Bioluminescent fungi and strange, dangling vines spilled slightly over the rusted metal lip, poolsing faintly with the sweet-smelling light. The rhythmic chanting from within was clearer now, a low, multitonal drone that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Below, Primus finally tore the raptor off his back, throwing its broken body aside. He ignored the remaining pack members circling him warily and looked up, his gaze locking onto Lena halfway up the ladder. He let out another guttural roar and charged towards the base. Lena climbed faster, muscles burning. She could hear his heavy breathing, the scrape of his claws on the concrete getting closer. She risked a glance down. He was almost directly beneath her, reaching up with one massive, clawed hand. Suddenly, the Alpha Raptor, perhaps seeing its chance to eliminate both threats, launched itself not at Primus but at the ladder itself. It leaped onto the lower rungs, shaking the entire structure violently. Lena clung on, her grip slipping on the rusted metal. Eris cried out from above as the ladder bucked. Primus, seeing the raptor interfering with his prey, swatted at it furiously. The alpha dodged back, avoiding the blow, and snapped at Primus's leg. Chaos reigned at the base of the ladder. "The rope!" Lena shouted upwards, pulling the grappling hook from her belt. "Catch!" She hurled it upwards towards Eris with all her strength. Eris, clinging precariously to the top rungs near the duct opening, fumbled the catch. The hook clattered against the metal lip of the duct, bounced off, and fell back down, striking sparks off the ladder rungs near Lena's head before continuing its descent. It landed with a clang near the base, right between Primus and the circling alpha raptor. Both paused their conflict, momentarily distracted by the falling object. Primus grunted, nudging the hook with his foot. The alpha raptor tilted its head, clicking curiously. "Plan B," Lena yelled, forcing herself upwards rung by painful rung. The ladder shuddered again as the alpha raptor renewed its attack on the structure. "Get inside the duct. Find something to anchor to." Eris didn't need telling twice. He hauled himself the final distance, rolling awkwardly over the rusted lip and into the darkness of the V8 duct, disappearing from Lena's sight. She heard him scrabbling inside, his flashlight beam momentarily illuminating strange, thick root systems and pulsating fungal growths within the duct's entrance. Lena was only a meter below the opening now. She could feel the warmth radiating from the duct, smell the cloying sweetness thick in the air. The chanting seemed to surround her, a disorienting wall of sound. Below, Primus roared again, apparently having dispatched or driven off the alpha raptor temporarily. He slammed his massive fist against the ladder, low down. Bolts groaned. One near the base sheared off with a sharp crack. The entire structure tilted precariously. Lena lunged upwards, grabbing the lip of the duct opening with one hand. Her feet scrabbled for purchase on the top rung as the ladder sagged further beneath her. With a final surge of adrenaline, she hauled herself up and over, tumbling into the V8 duct beside Eris. She landed heavily on a surprisingly soft surface, thick mosses and interwoven roots covering the metal floor of the giant ventilation shaft. The air inside was warm, humid, thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming nocturnal flowers, and composting vegetation. The only light came from Eris's flashlight beam, now playing deeper into the duct, and the pervasive, gentle bioluminescence emanating from strange fungi clinging to the walls and ceiling, and from thick, flowering vines that snaked across every surface. The chanting was louder here, seeming to come from deeper within, echoing down the vast, curving tunnel. Eris helped her up, his face pale but relieved in the green-gold glow. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Lena gasped, catching her breath. She crawled to the edge, peering back down into the hub. Below, Primus raged at the base of the now dangerously unstable ladder. He looked up at the duct opening, letting out a frustrated bellow. The remaining raptors kept their distance, seemingly unwilling to challenge him directly again, but they watched the duct opening with predatory intensity. "He can't reach us," Eris said, sounding hopeful. Don't count on it, Lena countered, scanning the area around the duct entrance. The ladder was useless now, possibly about to collapse. Primus was strong, cunning. He might find another way, and the raptors could likely climb the sheer walls if motivated enough. We need to move deeper, and quietly. She turned her attention inwards, sweeping her own flashlight beam down the V8 duct. It was like stepping into another world. The industrial metal structure of the ventilation shaft was almost completely obscured by rampant, accelerated plant growth. Thick vines, some as thick as her arm, formed intricate lattices across the walls and ceiling. Massive, broad-leafed plants pushed up from the floor, their surfaces slick with moisture. Strange, pod-like fruits hung from twisting branches, pulsing with faint light. The air vibrated with the sound of the chanting and the low hum of unseen processes. It wasn't just overgrown, it felt managed, cultivated. Epsilon biome overflow, Aris murmured, shining his light on a complex network of roots that seemed to actively pump glowing fluid. The temporal field here must be slower than baseline but significantly accelerated compared to the outside world. Generations of growth, adaptation. He touched a broad, velvety leaf. Incredible symbiosis. The fungi provide light, the flora provides structure and nutrients. And the gardeners provide the gardening, Lena finished grimly, pointing her beam deeper into the tunnel. The chanting seemed to originate from around a curve perhaps 50 meters ahead. She could see flickering movement in the shadows there, humanoid shapes obscured by the dense foliage. They started moving forward, stepping carefully over thick roots and through hanging vines. The mossy substrate muffled their footsteps, but the rustle of foliage seemed unnaturally loud in the humid air. The sweet smell intensified, becoming almost cloying, mixed with the earthy scent of loam and something else, a faint, coppery undertone. As they rounded the first major curve, the source of the chanting became clearer. In a wider section of the duct, several figures moved with slow, deliberate purpose. The Viridian kin. They resembled the description Aris had found, humanoid but gaunt, with skin possessing a noticeable greenish, chlorophyll-like tinge. They wore tattered remnants of Chronos Greenhouse uniforms, integrated now with woven plant fibers and living vines. Their movements were stiff, almost ritualistic, as they tended to the glowing flora, pruning vines with sharpened pieces of metal or bone, gathering phosphorescent pollens into woven baskets. Their heads were mostly bald, skin wrinkled like old bark, suggesting advanced age despite potentially slower personal time progression within the biome's influence. They didn't seem to have noticed Lena and Aris yet, their attention focused on their tasks and the rhythmic drone of their chant. "Fascinating," Aris whispered, raising his tablet to discreetly record. "Decades of isolation, symbiosis with the environment." Lena grabbed his arm, pulling the tablet down. "Less fascination, more infiltration, Doctor. We need to get through them, find an exit downstream from this biome, hopefully one that doesn't lead back to the raptors or Primus." She scanned the area. The duct continued onwards beyond the kin's current location. Side passages, smaller ventilation shafts branched off at intervals, choked with roots and fungi. Could one offer a bypass? Before they could decide on a course of action, one of the kin abruptly stopped chanting. Its head, overlarge and ancient-looking, slowly turned towards them. Its eyes, filmed over with a pale cataract-like layer, seemed to focus directly on their position despite the distance and dim light. It raised a long, thin arm, pointing a gnarled finger covered in what looked like lichen. The chanting faltered, other heads turned, the rhythmic work ceased. Silence fell in the verdant maw, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing plants and the distant, fatting sounds of chaos from the Theta hub behind them. The kin stood motionless, watching them, their expressions unreadable, ancient, and deeply unsettling. They weren't hostile, not yet, but they were aware. And Lena had the distinct impression they had been waiting. Chapter 5: The Pollen Sleep. The silence stretched, thick and humid, punctuated only by the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the bioluminescent flora. Lena felt the weight of maybe a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on them, ancient and milky, belonging to the Viridian kin who stood frozen amidst their strange garden. The chanting had stopped completely, leaving an unnerving stillness. Aris stood rigid beside her, his initial scientific curiosity evaporating, replaced by a primal awareness of being intruders in a place that operated by rules they didn't understand. "Maintain calm," Lena whispered, keeping her voice low and even. "No sudden moves. Let's see what they do." She kept her hands visible, away from any perceived weapons, though the heavy multi-tool felt reassuringly solid on her belt. The kin who had first spotted them, seemingly the eldest or the leader, took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its movements were stiff, joints popping softly like dry twigs snapping. It wore more elaborate woven vines than the others, incorporating small, polished bones and shimmering insect carapaces into its attire. It raised its free hand, palm outwards, in a gesture that might have been peaceful or might have been a warning. Its lips, thin and cracked like old parchment, moved, forming words, but the sound was a dry, rustling whisper, lost in the ambient hum of the duct. "I don't think they can speak normally anymore," Aris murmured, his voice barely audible. "Vocal cords adapted or disused." The lead kin took another slow step, then another. Others began to follow, moving with the same deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, fanning out slightly, not aggressively surrounding Lena and Aris, but certainly controlling the space. They carried their sharpened tools, bone knives, metal shards hafted onto wooden handles loosely at their sides. Their focus remained unnervingly steady. "They want us to move," Lena guessed. "Either forward, deeper into their territory, or back the way we came." Retreat wasn't an option, not with Primus potentially finding another way up and the raptors waiting below. Forward seemed equally perilous. "We need a diversion, a third path." Her eyes scanned the walls of the vast duct again. Several smaller, circular side tunnels branched off, likely secondary ventilation lines or maintenance access points. Most looked completely sealed by thick, interwoven root systems and fungal growths. But one, slightly higher up on the left wall, seemed less obstructed. A tangle of vines covered the opening, but behind them she thought she could see darkness, not solid blockage. It was maybe 3 meters off the floor level. "See that?" Lena breathed, subtly tilting her head towards the vine-choked opening. "Think we can reach it?" Aris followed her gaze. "Maybe, if we can climb those wall roots, but getting there without provoking them. The lead kin gestured again, more insistently this time, pointing deeper into the main duct, past their current position. The rustling whisper sound came again, slightly louder, carrying a faint undertone of impatience. Okay, stalling tactic, Lena decided. She took a cautious step forward, mirroring the kin's slow pace, moving deeper into the main duct as they seemed to want. Aris followed suit, looking extremely uncomfortable. The kin watched them, their milky eyes tracking every movement. They didn't resume their chanting, maintaining the tense silence. Lena kept her gaze sweeping, assessing the kin, their tools, their apparent physical state. They were gaunt, yes, but wiry. Their skin, though aged and bark-like, was stretched over lean muscle. Decades of slow-time adaptation and manual labor in this environment had likely made them stronger than they looked. And their connection to the environment, that was the biggest unknown. Could they influence the plants, control them? As they moved further into the wider section of the duct, Lena noticed more details. Skulls, small animal skulls, raptor skulls, even one distressingly human-looking skull, were embedded in the root structures along the walls like macabre decorations or warnings. Strange, intricate patterns were carved into the thicker fungal growths, symbols she didn't recognize. This wasn't just overgrowth. It was a habitat, a culture, evolved in isolation. They drew level with the main group of kin. Up close, the greenish tinge of their skin was more apparent, almost translucent in places, revealing networks of vein-like structures beneath. Their eyes, though clouded, seemed to track movement with uncanny accuracy. They smelled of damp earth, chlorophyll, and the pervasive sweet scent of the glowing flowers. Lena deliberately kept her gaze slightly averted, avoiding direct eye contact, a gesture often interpreted as non-aggression in the animal kingdom. Might work here. She continued her slow shuffle forward, angling slightly towards the left wall, towards the vine-covered opening she'd spotted. Suddenly, the lead kin stopped directly in front of them, blocking their path. It held up its hand again, palm flat. The rustling whisper intensified, becoming a low hiss. Other kin moved closer, subtly tightening the circle. Okay, plan B, Lena muttered. When I move, climb. Before Aris could react, Lena dropped low, grabbing a handful of the thick, powdery moss covering the floor. With a sudden yell, she flung it upwards, aiming for the faces of the nearest kin. Simultaneously, she pivoted and launched herself towards the left wall, grabbing onto a thick, gnarled root that snaked up towards the vine-covered opening. The moss exploded in a cloud of fine spores. The kin recoiled, startled, rustling and hissing in agitation. Some raised their arms to shield their faces, momentarily blinded or disoriented. Aris, climb, Lena shouted, finding purchase with her boots on the uneven root structure, pulling herself upwards. Aris jolted into action, scrambled after her, grabbing onto the same root system lower down. The kin recovered quickly, their hisses turning into higher-pitched, clicking sounds disturbingly reminiscent of the raptors, perhaps a form of alarm or anger. Several lunged towards the wall, raising their sharpened tools. Lena reached the level of the opening, tearing frantically at the thick vines obscuring it. They were tougher than they looked, woody and resilient. Behind the vines, darkness beckoned. Aris was right below her, struggling to get a good grip as Kin swiped at his legs from the floor. One connected, tearing his cargo pants, leaving a shallow scratch on his calf. He yelped in pain but kept climbing. A particularly large Kin, wielding a crude spear fashioned from sharpened rebar entwined with thorny vines, jabbed upwards towards Lena. She kicked out, deflecting the point just as she ripped the last of the obstructing vines away from the opening. It was a smaller duct, maybe a meter in diameter, leading horizontally into darkness. Inside, Lena ordered, shoving herself headfirst into the narrow tunnel. Aris scrambled the last meter, throwing himself into the opening just as the spear jabbed again, scraping against the metal edge of the duct where his leg had been moments before. Lena reached back, grabbed his arm, and pulled him fully inside. They lay panting in the cramped darkness of the side duct. It was blessedly free of the Kin's pervasive floral scent, smelling instead of stale air, dust, and faint rust. Outside in the main duct, the Kin clicked and hissed in frustration, their shadowy forms visible against the bioluminescent glow as they clustered around the opening, too large to easily follow. Some jabbed their tools into the entrance experimentally. "Are you hit?" Lena asked, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Scratched," Aris replied, his voice shaky. He shone his flashlight back towards the entrance. Several pairs of milky eyes peered in at them. "Think they'll try to come after us?" "Maybe," Lena said, crawling further into the side duct, putting distance between them and the entrance. "But this tunnel looks too small for them to navigate easily. Let's keep moving before they figure out another way." She turned her flashlight beam forward. The side duct was cylindrical, made of riveted metal sections, coated in decades of fine dust. Unlike the main V8 shaft, there was no rampant plant growth here, suggesting it didn't directly vent into or from a major biome's temporal field, or perhaps carried something inert. It seemed to slope gently downwards. They crawled onwards in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their own movements and the distant, fadding agitation of the Kin behind them. The air grew staler, dustier. After about 50 meters, the duct turned sharply downwards at a 45-degree angle, becoming more of a slide than a crawl space. "Careful," Lena warned, bracing herself before starting the descent. "Could be a straight drop further down." She slid cautiously, using her hands and feet to control her speed against the dusty metal. Aris followed, less gracefully, bumping against the sides. The downward slope continued for another 20 meters before leveling out abruptly. Lena slid out onto a flat section, finding herself in near total darkness as Aris tumbled out behind her, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily choked them both. Once the dust settled slightly, Lena swept her beam around. They were in a small, square junction box, maybe 2 meters by 2 meters. 3 other ducts, identical to the one they'd exited, led off in different directions, left, right, and straight ahead. Directly above them, a heavy metal grating formed the ceiling, covered in grime, blocking any view of what might be above. "Okay, choices again," Aris said, coughing. He consulted his tablet, but the signal was weak here, deep within the facility's infrastructure. Schematics are useless down here. This level of ductwork isn't mapped in the fragments I recovered. Lena shone her light down each of the 3 branching ducts. They all looked identical, dark, dusty, silent. "Eeny, meeny, miny, moe," she muttered. She listened intently. Was that a faint, dripping sound coming from the duct straight ahead, or just her imagination? Suddenly, Aris gasped, pointing his flashlight beam upwards at the grating above them. "Lena, look!" Caught in his beam, clinging upside down to the grimy metal bars of the grating, was a figure. Small, gaunt, dressed in rags that might once have been civilian clothing. Long, greasy hair hung down, partially obscuring a pale, emaciated face dominated by wide, dark eyes that stared down at them with unnerving intensity. The figure was unnaturally still, blending into the shadows until the light hit it directly. It made no sound. "Who the hell is that?" Lena breathed, instinctively reaching for her multi-tool again. Before the figure could react or they could react further, a low hissing sound started to emanate from the duct opening they had just exited. Not the clicking of the kin, but a softer, sibilant hiss. And accompanying it, a faint puff of airborne particles drifted out from the duct, catching the light like fine dust. It carried a vaguely familiar, sweet scent, but subtly different from the kin's floral aroma, drier, dustier. Pollen. The figure on the grating above shifted slightly, its dark eyes darting towards the duct entrance where the pollen was emerging. It seemed wary. "What is that?" Eris asked, squinting at the pollen cloud slowly drifting into the junction box. Lena didn't know, but she didn't like it. "Cover your mouth and nose," she ordered, pulling the neck gaiter she wore up over her face. Aris fumbled for a bandana in his pocket, tying it hastily. The hissing from the duct grew slightly louder. More pollen puffed out, swirling gently in the confined space. It began to settle on the floor, on their clothes, a fine, pale yellow powder. Lena felt a sudden wave of inexplicable drowsiness wash over her. Her eyelids felt heavy. The edges of her vision seemed to soften. "Aris," she said, her voice sounding slightly slurred even to her own ears. "You feeling sleepy?" "Yeah," Aris mumbled, swaying slightly on his feet. "Very sleepy like, after finals week." His flashlight beam dipped towards the floor. The figure on the grating above suddenly dropped down into the junction box with surprising agility, landing silently despite the fall. It scrambled backwards away from the pollen source, pressing itself into the corner furthest from the duct they'd arrived from. Its wide eyes darted between the pollen cloud and the 2 increasingly drowsy humans. It still hadn't made a sound. Lena fought against the crushing weariness. Alarm bells were ringing dimly in the back of her mind. This wasn't normal sleepiness. It was induced, drugged. She tried to raise her flashlight to focus on the figure, but her arm felt like lead. The junction box seemed to tilt gently. The hissing sound was soft, soothing, hypnotic. "Trap," she managed to force out, the word thick on her tongue. Aris mumbled something incoherent, then his knees buckled. He slumped against the wall, his flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling grating where the silent figure had been moments before. He was out cold. Lena struggled to stay upright, leaning heavily against the junction box wall. The pollen was thick in the air now, coating everything. The hissing seemed to be inside her head. She could see the silent figure watching her from the corner, its expression unreadable in the dim, failing light from her own dropping flashlight. Was it responsible, or another victim? Her vision blurred further. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the silent figure cautiously approaching the unconscious heiress, reaching out with a thin, grimy hand not in aggression, but as if to check his pulse. Then everything faded to black. Chapter 6: Echoes in the Ducts. Lena surfaced from darkness like a diver rising too quickly from crushing depths. Pressure throbbed behind her eyes, a dull, persistent ache. Her mouth felt like it was coated in fine grit, and her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The cloying sweetness of the pollen lingered as a phantom taste, a cloying memory that turned her stomach. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air was close, stale, thick with the smell of dust and old metal. Where was she? She forced her eyes open. Darkness. No, not complete darkness. Faint light filtered from somewhere unseen, casting the immediate surroundings into weak relief. She was lying on something hard and cold, sheet metal. Above her, a low ceiling crisscrossed with pipes and conduits, barely an arm's length away. Confined. She tried to sit up, muscles protesting, head swimming dizzily. A soft rustle nearby made her freeze. Her hand instinctively went to her belt, fingers brushing the familiar shape of her multi-tool, still there. She blinked, trying to make her eyes adjust faster. Across the small space, maybe 2 meters away, a figure sat hunched against the opposite wall, knees drawn up to its chest. It was the silent figure from the junction box, the one who had dropped from the grating. In the dim light, she could make out more details now. Thin, unnervingly so, the skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones and collarbones visible beneath ragged, filthy clothing that might once have been standard civilian attire. Long, matted dark hair fell around a face smudged with grime, making it hard to gauge age, but the eyes. The eyes were wide, dark, and intensely alert, tracking her every micro-movement. They held a disturbing clarity, a focused awareness that contrasted sharply with the figure's apparent physical neglect. It held something small and metallic in one hand, turning it over and over, perhaps a discarded piece of machinery, a habit born of long isolation. Lena slowly pushed herself into a sitting position, leaning back against the cold metal wall. Her head swam, and she pressed the heels of her palms against her temples, trying to clear the fog. The pollen's effects lingered, a heavy sedative blanket. She scanned the immediate area. They were in what looked like a small maintenance alcove or monitoring post set off from a main duct line. Roughly 3 meters square, walls lined with defunct instrument panels, screens cracked and dark. Exposed wiring hung like dead vines. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by their presence and the trails left by the silent figure. A single ventilation grate high on one wall provided the faint light and a trickle of slightly fresher, though still stagnant, air. Where was Aris? She spotted him slumped against the wall beside her, still unconscious, his breathing shallow but regular. His face was pale, lips slightly parted. The makeshift bandana he'd used as a mask lay discarded beside him. Lena reached over, feeling his neck for a pulse. Steady. Good. She checked the leg of his trousers where the kin's tool had scratched him. The fabric was torn and dried blood stained the edges, but the wound itself looked superficial, a long, shallow scrape already starting to scab over. Lucky. Her gaze returned to the silent figure. It hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to her checking Eris, just watched with those unnervingly intense eyes. Male? Female? Hard to tell beneath the grime and hair. Lean build. Likely male, she guessed, remembering Eris's mention of Giant. "Who are you?" Lena asked, her voice raspy, rough from sleep and dust. The figure flinched almost imperceptibly at the direct sound, the small metal object falling from its hand with a soft clink. It didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Its eyes remained locked on her. "Did you bring us here?" Lena tried again, keeping her tone level, non-threatening. "Away from the pollen." The figure gave a slight, jerky nod, barely noticeable. It retrieved the fallen metal piece, resuming its silent contemplation of the object. Giant, Lena risked, remembering the name from Eris's logs. This time the reaction was more pronounced. The figure's head snapped up, eyes widening slightly. A flicker of something: recognition, fear, pain, crossed its gaunt features before being instantly suppressed, replaced by the same guarded watchfulness. It neither confirmed nor denied, simply retreated further into its silence. "Okay, assume it's Maz. Civilian researcher, psychology, trapped here since the incident. Survived alone for years in this hellhole. That would explain the silence, the hypervigilance, the emaciated state. He'd likely seen things, done things to survive." "Thank you," Lena said sincerely, "for pulling us out of that, whatever that pollen was." Maz offered no response, his attention seemingly returning to the small metal piece, though Lena felt his awareness remained sharply focused on her and the still unconscious Eris. She needed water. Her throat felt scraped raw. She fumbled for the canteen on her belt, still half full. She unscrewed the cap, the plastic squeaking loudly in the confined space, making Maz jump slightly. She took a small sip, swishing it around her dusty mouth before swallowing. The cool liquid helped cut through the lingering grogginess. She offered the canteen towards Maz. He recoiled instantly, pressing himself flatter against the wall, eyes wide with alarm, shaking his head vehemently. "Okay," Lena said softly, withdrawing the canteen. "Okay, trust issues, severe ones, understandable." She took another sip herself, then carefully screwed the cap back on. She needed to assess their situation. They were in a relatively secure pocket, hidden off the main duct system. But for how long? What was the source of the pollen? The hissing sound seemed to have faded, or perhaps it couldn't penetrate this alcove. What other dangers lurked in these narrow, unmapped passages? Eris stirred beside her, groaning softly. His eyelids fluttered. Lena gently shook his shoulder. "Eris, wake up." He mumbled something incoherent, swatting weakly at her hand. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused, bleary. "Lena, what happened? Head feels like concrete." He blinked, trying to orient himself, his gaze slowly taking in the cramped, dim alcove, then landing on Maz huddled against the far wall. He stiffened, eyes widening. "Who?" "Easy," Lena said. "I think it's Giant, the researcher you mentioned. Seems he pulled us out of that pollen trap in the junction." Eris stared at Maz, recognition dawning mixed with apprehension. Giant, he's alive. He struggled to sit up, wincing as his head throbbed. The pollen felt like being anesthetized. He touched the scratch on his leg, inspecting it gingerly. He dragged us both in here. Maz watched Eris's movements with the same wary intensity he'd shown Lena, offering no confirmation beyond his continued silent presence. Seems like it, Lena confirmed. He doesn't talk or won't. She looked around the small space again. Question is, where is here exactly and how do we get out? Eris pulled out his tablet, tapping the screen. It flickered weakly, displaying low battery warnings and no network signal. Useless for navigation down here, completely off schematic. He looked around the alcove, his researcher's instincts kicking in despite the lingering effects of the pollen. He shone his flashlight beam, retrieved from where it had fallen beside him over the defunct instrument panels. Old environmental monitoring station, maybe, for the tertiary duct systems. Must have been bypassed or decommissioned long before the main shutdown. His beam lingered on strange scratches and markings on the metal walls near where Maz sat, repetitive symbols, crude drawings that looked like distorted maps or diagrams of monstrous creatures. Maz's work, years of solitary obsession, etched onto the walls of his refuge. Maz flinched away from the flashlight beam, turning his face away, shielding his eyes. "Sorry," Eris murmured, lowering the beam. He directed it instead towards the ventilation grate high on the wall. "That's our air source. Where does it lead?" Lena stood up carefully, testing her balance. Still a bit unsteady, but better. She moved towards the grate, standing on her toes to peer through the dusty slots. She couldn't see much, just the suggestion of another narrow duct or shaft beyond, equally dark. The air flowing in was faint, barely enough to stir the dust motes. A sudden scraping sound echoed from outside the alcove, seeming to come from the main duct they'd presumably been dragged from. It was the sound of metal on metal, rhythmic, exploratory. Lena froze, signaling for silence. Eris switched off his flashlight. Maz became utterly still, a statue carved from grime and shadow. They listened intently in the suffocating silence of the alcove. The scraping continued, moving slowly closer. It paused, then resumed, accompanied by a low, wet clicking sound that sent a chill down Lena's spine. Not raptors, not kin, something else. Lena drew her multi-tool, extending the blade silently. Eris fumbled for a heavy wrench he carried clipped to his pack, gripping it tightly. Maz remained motionless, but his eyes, wide in the dimness, were fixed on the low entrance tunnel leading into their alcove. The scraping stopped right outside the entrance. The wet clicking intensified. Something shifted in the darkness just beyond the opening. Lena could hear faint, ragged breathing, punctuated by soft, guttural clicks. A shadow moved, blocking part of the already dim light filtering from the main duct. Then a shape began to emerge, squeezing itself through the low opening. Long, segmented limbs, tipped with sharp chitinous claws, scraped against the metal floor. A multifaceted eye glistening wetly swiveled towards them, reflecting the faint light with cold indifference. It was followed by another, then a section of bulbous, pulsating abdomen covered in coarse, dark bristles. The creature paused, seeming to taste the air with quivering antennae. It looked like some nightmarish fusion of insect and crustacean, evolved or devolved in the greenhouse's temporal chaos, adapted to the narrow confines of the ductwork. A corridor skulker, perhaps, like the scavengers described in fragmented reports. It hadn't fully detected them yet, its movements slow, cautious. Lena held her breath. Any sudden movement, any sound would betray their position. Aris was white-knuckled on his wrench, trembling almost uncontrollably. Maz, however, moved. Not towards the creature, but sideways, flattening himself further against the wall. His hand darted out, grasping a loose piece of conduit lying amongst the debris near his feet. With a sudden, sharp flick of his wrist, he threw the conduit towards the opposite side of the alcove entrance. It clattered loudly against the metal wall, echoing in the confined space. The effect on the skulker was immediate. Its head snapped towards the sound, multiple eyes focusing instantly. It let out a series of sharp, aggressive clicks and scuttled rapidly towards the source of the noise, ignoring the alcove's occupants entirely. Its segmented body squeezed fully through the opening and disappeared around the corner into the main duct, chasing the phantom disturbance. Silence returned, heavier than before. Lena slowly let out the breath she'd been holding. Aris sagged against the wall, letting the wrench clatter from his numb fingers. Maz remained pressed against the wall, watching the entrance, his breathing shallow. "Quick thinking," Lena whispered towards Maz, genuinely impressed by the diversionary tactic. Simple, effective, born of long experience with these light-sensitive or sound-sensitive predators. Maz offered no acknowledgement. He pushed himself away from the wall and crawled swiftly towards the entrance, peering cautiously out into the main duct. After a moment, he looked back, gesturing urgently for them to follow. Whatever that creature was, it was gone for now, but he clearly didn't think staying put was safe. Lena helped Aris to his feet. "Can you move?" "I think so," Aris replied, testing his weight. His head still pounded, but the immediate terror had cleared some of the pollen fog. "Where are we going?" "Following our silent guide," Lena said, nodding towards Maz, who was already disappearing into the darkness of the main duct. "Seems he knows these tunnels better than we do. Let's hope he's leading us somewhere better, not somewhere worse." They exited the relative safety of the alcove, stepping back into the narrow, dusty duct from which Maz had presumably dragged them. He was waiting a few meters ahead, a silhouette against the deeper darkness, beckoning them onward with impatient hand gestures before turning and moving away again at a surprising speed, his ragged form blending into the shadows. Lena swept her flashlight beam quickly around the section of duct where the skulker had been. Glistening trails of slime coated the floor and walls, along with deep scratches in the metal. Best not to linger. She and Aris hurried after Maz, their footsteps echoing disturbingly in the confined metal tube. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the silence broken only by their movements and the distant, unidentifiable sounds of the vast, decaying facility around them. Dripping water, groaning metal, and sometimes, carried on the faint air currents, the distant roar of something large and angry, or the high-pitched shriek of hyper-evolved predators. They were deeper in the guts of the Chronos Greenhouse than ever before, guided by a man who hadn't spoken in years, towards an unknown destination, with unseen horrors potentially lurking around every bend. Chapter 7: The Mnemosyne Bloom. The ductwork became a disorienting maze. Maz moved through the intersecting tunnels and crawl spaces with a certainty that spoke of years spent navigating this hidden underworld. He rarely paused, communicating only through urgent hand gestures of pointing directions, signaling for caution, waving them forward. Lena and Aris struggled to keep up, their flashlights carving arcs through the oppressive darkness, revealing glimpses of rusted machinery, decaying insulation, and occasionally, disconcerting signs of other inhabitants. More glistening slime trails, shed exoskeletons brittle as glass, nests made of shredded wires and unidentifiable organic matter. The air remained stagnant, thick with the smell of dust, rust, and decay, occasionally freshened by faint drafts from unseen connections to larger systems. Aris, despite his lingering disorientation and throbbing head, tried to make sense of their path, occasionally whispering observations to Lena. "We seem to be moving generally downwards, and maybe east, towards the older sections of the facility based on the construction style. Pre-Chronos initiative, maybe." He tapped his dead tablet screen in frustration. Without schematics, it's pure guesswork. Maz led them through cramped vertical shafts requiring awkward climbing, across narrow catwalks spanning echoing voids filled with stagnant water reflecting their lights eerily, and along horizontal ducts where they had to crawl on hands and knees. He moved with a silent, economical grace, conserving energy, always listening, always watching. Several times he froze abruptly, signaling them to halt and extinguish their lights, pressing himself flat against a wall or into a shadowy recess. They would wait in absolute darkness, listening to faint scuttling sounds nearby, or distant, heavier movements vibrating through the metal structure, until Maz deemed it safe to proceed. He seemed to possess an uncanny sixth sense for the dangers lurking in the tunnels. After what felt like hours but was impossible to gauge accurately in the timeless dark, Maz slowed their pace. He held up a hand, signaling caution more insistently than before. He crept forward to a junction where their current duct intersected with a much larger one, perhaps 2 meters high and wide. He peered around the corner, then quickly pulled back, flattening himself against the wall. He looked back at Lena and Aris, his eyes wide, and shook his head vehemently, gesturing downwards, indicating danger below, or perhaps something on the floor of the larger duct. Lena crept forward, Aris close behind her, until she could cautiously peer around the corner herself. The larger duct stretched away into darkness in both directions. It wasn't empty. The floor was covered, almost carpeted, with a strange, thick, spongy growth that pulsed with a faint internal bioluminescence, casting the tunnel in a soft, undulating blue-green light. It looked like a cross between moss, coral, and fungal mycelium, forming complex, brain-like folds and ridges. Embedded within its surface like grotesque inclusions were various objects: rusted tools, discarded data chips, pieces of bone, shattered glassware, even what looked disturbingly like a pair of cracked spectacles similar to Aris's. The air here carried a different scent, not decay, but something sharp, electric, like ozone mixed with damp earth, and something vaguely metallic. "What is that?" Aris breathed, his voice hushed with awe and apprehension. He recognized the description from fragmented, highly classified research notes he'd only glimpsed years ago. Memory moss, Mnemosyne culture, Project Chimera. Memory moss, Lena whispered back. What does it do? Theoretical bioorganic data storage, Aris explained, his gaze fixed on the pools in growth. Designed to absorb and retain information, sensory data, electrical impulses, memories. They thought they could create a living archive. Touch was supposed to initiate data transfer. He shuddered. Early reports mentioned instability, uncontrolled absorption, psychic feedback loops. They officially scrapped the project, classified it top secret. So this was another failed experiment, thriving uncontrolled in the depths of the facility. Growing, feeding on. What? Ambient energy, lost data streams, organic matter. The embedded objects suggested a disturbing lack of discrimination. Maz watched them, his expression tight with what looked like fear. He pointed emphatically away from the memory moss-filled duct, back the way they came, or towards another, smaller branching tunnel nearby. He clearly wanted nothing to do with the glowing carpet. Suddenly, a section of the moss directly below their vantage point pulsed brighter. A low hum emanated from it, resonating through the metal structure. Faint, ghost-like images seemed to flicker within its depths, fragmented faces, snippets of frantic movement, bursts of static resembling corrupted code. It was like watching fragments of forgotten nightmares surface. Then a clear image resolved itself within the pulsing light, startlingly vivid. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, or rather, an echo of him back in central control, frantically working at the console just before the power surge. The moss had absorbed the moment, the electrical energy, the fear. The image played out, silent but intense, Aris slamming his hand on the screen, the flare of light. Then it dissolved back into swirling patterns. Aris stared, horrified and fascinated. It recorded me. How? Ambient electrical discharge, psychic resonance. Who knows how this thing actually works, Lena muttered. Point is, it's active and dangerous. Another image flickered, a brief, terrifying glimpse of Subject Primus bursting through the service corridor door, roaring. Then, a raptor screeching, caught in the neural weaver web. Then, fragments of the kin chanting in the V8 duct. The moss seemed to be replaying recent, high-energy events it had somehow perceived, even at this distance. Maz tugged urgently at Lena's sleeve, pointing again towards the alternative escape route, his eyes pleading. He wanted out, away from this psychic quagmire. Lena nodded. Okay, we're going. But as she turned to follow Maz towards the smaller duct, Aris remained frozen, his gaze locked on the memory moss. Wait, Aris whispered, holding up a hand. If it records, if it holds memories, maybe it recorded something useful, access codes, security protocols, the cause of the original incident, maybe even data from Maz's experiences before. He took a step closer to the edge of the junction, peering down at the pulsing growth. Aris, no, Lena warned sharply, grabbing his arm. The reports mentioned uncontrolled absorption, feedback loops. We don't know what touching that stuff will do. But the knowledge, Aris argued, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. Think what we could learn. We could understand how to stop this, how to reverse it. He pulled his arm free, his eyes gleaming with obsessive intensity in the blue-green light. Maz let out a choked sound, a strangled gasp, the first noise Lena had heard him make. He scrambled backwards away from Aris, shaking his head violently, eyes wide with terror. He clearly knew the dangers firsthand. "Doctor, don't be an idiot," Lena snapped, trying to pull him back again. But Aris was already crouching at the edge, reaching down tentatively towards a relatively clear patch of the moss, avoiding the embedded debris. Just a quick touch, controlled contact. His fingertips brushed the surface. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The entire section of memory moss beneath him flared with blinding blue-white light. The low hum escalated into a deafening roar that filled the duct. Aris screamed, convulsing, his body locked rigid as if hit by a massive electrical charge. Images erupted from the moss around his hand with frantic, chaotic speed. Not just recent events, but a dizzying torrent of disconnected sensory data. Scientists in lab coats shouting, alarms blaring, the screech of tearing metal, the faces of the kin chanting, the chilling clicks of raptors hunting, the roar of Primus, the terrified eyes of Maz trapped in darkness, flashes of complex equations dissolving into static, the feeling of crushing despair, blinding pain, suffocating darkness. Lena threw herself at Aris, tackling him away from the edge, breaking the physical contact. They tumbled back into their own duct, away from the main junction. The light and sound from the moss instantly subsided, returning to its previous low hum and gentle pulsing, though the images within swirled more erratically now, disturbed, agitated. Aris lay on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide and unfocused, gasping for breath. Foam flecked his lips. "Too much," he choked out. "Saw everything, everyone, all at once, trapped, screaming." He clutched his head, rocking back and forth. "It's still in my head." Lena knelt beside him, concerned. The psychic feedback loop Aris's own logs had warned about. He hadn't just accessed the data. He'd been flooded, overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered memories and emotions stored within the moss, potentially decades worth. Maz crept forward from his hiding place, his earlier fear momentarily replaced by something that looked almost like pity as he stared at the trembling Aris. He reached into a pouch on his ragged belt and pulled out a small, dried, shriveled mushroom cap. He hesitated, then offered it tentatively towards Lena, pointing first at the mushroom, then at Aris's head, then making a calming, smoothing motion with his hands. Lena looked from the strange mushroom to Maz's earnest face. A counteragent, something to soothe the psychic overload, a local remedy discovered through years of desperate survival. It was a huge risk, but Aris was clearly in distress, potentially suffering permanent psychological damage. "What is it?" Lena asked, though she knew Maz wouldn't answer. She took the mushroom cautiously. It smelled faintly earthy, slightly bitter. She looked at Aris, whose tremors were worsening, his breathing becoming ragged. She had to make a choice. Trust the silent madman who seemed to know this subterranean hell better than anyone. She broke off a tiny piece of the dried cap, barely a crumb. "Aris," she said gently, trying to get his attention. "Aris, look at me. Try to eat this. It might help." Eris didn't seem to hear her, lost in the internal storm of absorbed memories. Lena carefully placed the small mushroom fragment on his tongue. He barely reacted. She took her canteen, uncapped it, and gently poured a small amount of water into his mouth. He coughed, sputtered, but reflexively swallowed. They waited. Maz watched intently, clutching his small metal totem. Eris continued to shake for another minute, then gradually, the tremors began to subside. His breathing evened out slightly. His eyes, though still distant and haunted, seemed to regain a fraction of focus. He blinked, looking at Lena, then at Maz, confusion warring with the residual terror. "WH," he started, his voice weak. "Easy," Lena said soothingly. "Just rest." It seemed Maz's remedy, whatever it was, had worked, or at least dampened the worst of the feedback. But Eris was clearly shaken, vulnerable, and they were still trapped in the ducts, with the memory moss humming disturbingly nearby and unknown terrors potentially lurking deeper within the facility's bowels. Maz stood up. He looked back towards the memory moss junction with evident fear, then pointed determinedly down the small side duct he had indicated earlier. He tapped his own chest, then pointed down the tunnel, then made a walking motion with his fingers, followed by a gesture indicating safety or refuge. He was telling them his own path, his sanctuary, lay that way. He wouldn't go near the moss again. Lena looked at Eris, still weak and disoriented. Could he make it? Could she trust Maz not to lead them into another trap or simply abandon them? But staying here, near the psychic minefield of the memory moss, felt infinitely more dangerous. "Okay, Maz," Lena said, making her decision. She helped Eris slowly, painfully to his feet, supporting his weight. "Lead the way." Maz nodded curtly, his relief palpable. He turned and melted back into the darkness of the side duct, trusting them to follow. Lena half carried, half guided the still fragile Eris after him, leaving the unsettling glow and hum of the living archive behind them, venturing deeper into the unknown territory governed by the silent, haunted survivor. Chapter 8: The Silent Survivor's Sanctum. The side duct Maz led them into was even narrower and more neglected than the previous ones. Dust lay so thick it felt like wading through fine sand, muffling their footsteps but puffing up in choking clouds with every movement. Sections of the metal were badly corroded, eaten away by years of damp or perhaps chemical leakage, revealing glimpses of the packed earth and rock the facility had been built into or around. The air was colder here, the stagnant silence broken only by their own breathing and the occasional drip of unseen water. Eris leaned heavily on Lena, his steps unsteady. The small dose of Maz's mushroom seemed to have stabilized him, preventing a complete mental collapse, but the experience with the memory moss had clearly taken a severe toll. His eyes darted nervously into the shadows, and he flinched at every small sound. The flood of raw data and emotion had left him psychically scarred, hypersensitive. "Saw pieces," Eris mumbled, his voice hoarse, barely audible as they shuffled forward. The initial breach, gamma biome, wasn't just Primus, something else. A trigger, code cascade, sabotage. He shook his head, clutching his temples. too fragmented like shattered glass, hurts to remember. Lena didn't press him. Whatever he'd glimpsed, forcing him to relive it now wouldn't help. Focus on walking, Doctor, one foot in front of the other. Maz moved ahead steadily, his small form navigating the cramped, decaying tunnel with practiced ease. He paused occasionally, testing loose floor panels, checking corroded pipe junctions, ensuring the path was relatively safe before waving them on. He seemed driven now, eager to reach his destination. Lena wondered what kind of sanctuary someone could carve out in this decaying hellhole. After another period of slow, exhausting travel, the duct began to open up slightly. Maz stopped ahead, signaling caution. He pointed towards a section of the right-hand wall where the corroded metal had partially collapsed inwards, revealing a narrow opening into darkness beyond. He squeezed through the gap and disappeared. Lena hesitated. This felt different, not just another section of ductwork. She helped Aris towards the opening. Easy does it. She peered through the gap first. Beyond the broken metal was not another tunnel, but a small, natural-looking cave or fissure in the rock, perhaps 5 meters across. It seemed Maz hadn't just navigated the facility's infrastructure. He'd found pathways outside of it, utilizing natural geology where the man-made structures had failed. Lena squeezed through the jagged opening, careful not to snag her gear, then helped the weakened Aris through after her. The air inside the cave was noticeably different, cooler, damper, with the clean scent of wet rock and earth replacing the pervasive dust and decay of the ducts. Maz stood near the center of the small cave, waiting. This was clearly his place. The floor was relatively level, swept clean of loose debris. Against one wall, a pathetic collection of belongings was arranged with neat, obsessive precision. Ragged blankets folded tightly, a small stash of scavenged canned goods, labels long gone, several containers of collected water, a broken flashlight repaired with tape and wire, and an assortment of strange objects, polished stones, unique gears from forgotten machinery, colorful shards of plastic, arranged in careful patterns. A survivor's treasures, totems against the overwhelming isolation. In one corner, crude drawings covered the rock wall, similar to the ones in the monitoring station alcove, more complex here, depicting the layout of nearby duct systems, potential hazards marked with skulls or jagged symbols, escape routes highlighted. There were sketches of the creatures they'd encountered, raptors drawn with vicious, sharp lines, the Viridian kin depicted as stick figures tending to oversized, glowing plants, a hulking shape labeled Primus, a multi-limbed horror representing the skulker. And there were other things too, shapes Lena didn't recognize, something vast and tentacled labeled Deep Grower. Images of temporal distortions rendered as swirling vortexes. It was a map of Maz's personal hell, a testament to years spent observing and evading the horrors of the Chronos Greenhouse. Perhaps most disturbingly, tucked away in a lower corner, was a crudely drawn self-portrait, a stick figure with wide, terrified eyes, labeled simply me, surrounded by the monstrous shapes. Maz watched them take it all in, his expression unreadable but betraying a hint of vulnerability. This was his home, his refuge, exposed now to outsiders. He gestured towards the blankets, indicating they could rest. "Thank you, Maz," Lena said softly, genuinely grateful for the respite. She helped Eris settle onto one of the threadbare blankets. He sank down with a sigh of relief, leaning his head back against the cool rock wall, closing his eyes. The relative safety, the slightly fresher air, seemed to ease some of his tension. Lena remained standing, scanning the small cave. It felt secure, defensible. The only entrance was the narrow gap they'd come through, easily blocked or watched. No other tunnels seemed to lead directly into it. How had Maz found this place? How long had he been using it? Maz moved towards his water containers. He picked up a battered metal cup, filled it carefully, and offered it to Lena. She accepted it gratefully, taking a long drink. The water was cool, tasting slightly of minerals, infinitely better than the stale water in her canteen. He then offered water to Eris, who accepted it with a mumbled word of thanks, sipping it slowly. Maz retreated to his own corner, sitting amongst his arranged treasures, picking up the small metal gear he often fiddled with. He seemed content, for the moment, simply to observe them, sharing his space but maintaining his distance. The silence returned, but here it felt less oppressive, more like a shared truce. Lena sat down near Eris, keeping watch on the entrance, her multi-tool resting loosely in her lap. She needed to think. They were safe for now, but they couldn't stay here indefinitely. Their goal remained the same: find a way out of the facility, or at least find concrete data proving what happened here, something Eris could use. Maz had helped them survive, but could he help them escape? Did he even want to escape? This cave, this routine, might be the only life he knew now. Eris seemed to be recovering slightly. The haunted look hadn't left his eyes, but the tremors had stopped, and some color was returning to his face. He looked over at Maz, then at the drawings on the wall. "He mapped it," Eris murmured. "He mapped the dangers, the creatures, maybe even the temporal anomalies." He pushed himself up slightly, his gaze fixed on the wall map. "Lena, look, that symbol, the vortex. He's marked locations where he's encountered localized time slips. And here," he pointed to a section depicting ducts near what might be the facility's lower foundations. "The deep grower, with tentacles. Could that be related to the original project failure? Something geological interacting with the temporal fields?" Before Lena could respond, Maz reacted. He scrambled over to the wall map, his movements agitated. He covered the deep grower drawing with his hands, shaking his head vehemently, letting out a series of soft clicking sounds, almost like choked-off warnings. He clearly didn't want them focusing on that particular horror. He pointed instead towards a different section of the map, a crudely drawn representation of the outer facility structure, with an arrow pointing towards a specific marked exit point on the far side, away from the main entrance they'd used. He tapped the exit point insistently, then looked at them, his expression conveying a clear message. "Out. That way." "He knows a way out?" Eris asked, hope flickering in his voice. Maz nodded eagerly, tapping the map again. He then pointed towards the entrance gap they'd used to enter the cave, then made a gesture indicating a long, difficult journey through more tunnels, eventually leading to the marked exit. "Can you lead us?" Lena asked directly. "Will you take us there?" Maz hesitated for a long moment, his gaze flickering between them, the map and the cave entrance, as if weighing the risks. Leaving his sanctuary, guiding these unpredictable outsiders through dangerous territory. It was a monumental decision. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Yes. Relief washed over Lena. It was a chance, perhaps their only chance. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The route Maz indicated on his map crossed through sections marked with raptor symbols, warnings about unstable structures, and proximity to areas labeled kin territory and primus hunting ground. And it bypassed the deep grower area by a wide margin, suggesting Maz considered that threat insurmountable or simply too terrifying to contemplate. Okay, Lena said, meeting Maz's gaze. We rest here for a short while. Let Aris recover a bit more strength. Then you lead, we follow, agreed. Maz nodded again, seeming satisfied with the plan. He retreated back to his corner, resuming his silent vigil over his belongings. Lena checked on Aris. He seemed more lucid now, though still fragile. How are you feeling? Think you can travel soon? Aris nodded slowly. Yes, better. The echoes are quieter now, just need a little more time. He looked over at Maz. He survived down here for years, alone, incredible and terrifying. He adapted, Lena said quietly. Or broke, maybe both. They rested in the relative quiet of the cave for what might have been an hour. Aris drank more water and managed to eat a compressed nutrient bar from Lena's pack, regaining some strength. Lena used the time to quickly clean and check her limited gear, ensuring everything was ready. Maz remained in his corner, occasionally making minute adjustments to the arrangement of his treasures, lost in his own world, yet simultaneously hyper-aware of his surroundings. Finally, Lena decided they couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every moment spent idle increased the risk of something finding them. Aris, ready. He nodded, pushing himself stiffly to his feet. As I'll ever be. Lena looked at Maz. He understood immediately. He stood up, tucked his small metal totem into his pouch, and moved towards the cave entrance without a backward glance at his sanctuary. He squeezed through the gap, waiting for them in the dusty darkness of the duct beyond. Lena helped Aris through the opening, then followed herself, leaving the small pocket of relative safety behind. They were back in the labyrinth, putting their trust entirely in the silent survivor, heading towards a dubious exit on the far side of the facility, through territory marked by monsters and madness. Maz set off at a determined pace, and they hurried to keep up, plunging deeper into the decaying heart of the Chronos Greenhouse. Chapter 9. Scars of the Labyrinth. Leaving the relative peace of Maz's cave felt like stepping from a brief pause back into the grinding gears of the nightmare. The duct Maz led them into immediately felt different, wider, more rectangular than cylindrical, suggesting a main utility corridor rather than simple ventilation. Thick bundles of cables, coated in grime and sagging precariously from rusted supports, lined the ceiling. Large pipes, some weeping suspicious brown fluids that sizzled faintly where they dripped onto the metal floor, ran along one wall. The air tasted metallic, heavy with the scent of corrosion and stagnant water. Maz moved faster now, a determined urgency in his stride. He seemed to shed some of his cautious hesitation, driven by the promise of the exit marked on his map, the escape he clearly craved despite his adaptation to this underworld. Lena and Aris hurried to keep pace, their flashlights cutting beams through the gloom, revealing endless stretches of decaying infrastructure. Aris, though still pale and moving stiffly, seemed more stable. The immediate psychic storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of mental scars and fragmented echoes. He walked with his head slightly tilted, as if listening to whispers only he could hear, his eyes occasionally darting towards innocuous shadows or flickering with remembered terror. Their route took them steadily deeper into what felt like the bowels of the facility's support systems. They passed junctions leading to cavernous, echoing chambers filled with the skeletal remains of massive pumps or generators, long silent. They navigated sections where the floor plating had rusted through, forcing them onto narrow, treacherous support beams spanning dark, stagnant pools below. Maz guided them expertly, testing each foothold, pointing out weak spots, his silent communication economical and precise. After perhaps an hour of relentless travel, Maz slowed, holding up a hand for caution. He pointed towards the floor. Lena directed her beam downwards. Imprinted in the thick layer of industrial grime were massive, distorted footprints, far larger than human, deeper than their own. They showed an uneven gait, one foot dragging slightly, but the sheer size and weight implied by the impressions were unmistakable. Scattered nearby were gnawed bones, larger than the avian or rodent remains they'd seen previously. Thick, heavy bones, possibly from some kind of large mammal used in early experiments, or perhaps something more recent. Aris shone his light on Maz's crude wall map, which Maz had briefly consulted before signaling caution. "His map marks this section," Aris whispered, his voice tight. "Primus hunting ground." Maz nodded grimly, confirming Aris's interpretation. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed ahead, indicating they needed to cross this territory. He moved forward with extreme stealth now, placing each foot with deliberate care, melting into the shadows cast by the large pipes. Lena and Aris followed, mimicking his silence. Every creak of rusting metal, every drip of water sounded deafeningly loud. The air felt heavy, charged with unseen menace. Lena kept her multi-tool blade extended, sweeping her light in low arcs, checking corners, listening intently. Aris gripped his wrench, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with remembered fear from the memory moss fragments featuring the devolved security chief. They passed a side passage where a heavy steel door had been literally torn from its hinges, the metal twisted and ripped like paper. Further on, deep gouges scarred the walls, marks left by something immensely strong and brutally careless. They moved through the area for what felt like an eternity, the tension coiling tighter with every step. Twice they heard distant sounds, a heavy crash, echoing from deep within connecting tunnels, and later, a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath their feet. Each time, Maz froze them in place, waiting motionless in the darkness until the silence returned before cautiously proceeding. Finally, after traversing perhaps 200 meters of the marked territory, Maz signaled that they were clear, letting out a shaky breath he seemed unaware he'd been holding. He picked up the pace again, relief making him almost reckless for a few moments before his habitual caution reasserted itself. Their path soon forced them upwards, climbing through a series of vertical access shafts, ladders thankfully still intact. This brought them into a network of smaller, warmer ducts, the air carrying the faint, dusty, musky scent Lena associated with the raptors. Clicking sounds, distant but distinct, echoed intermittently through the metal tubes. Maz paused at another junction, consulting his internal map or memory. He pointed down one duct, then made a sharp gesture indicating danger. Raptor symbols littered this section on his wall map. He pointed down the other fork, indicating it was longer, involving structural instability but safer from predators. He looked at them questioningly. "The safer route," Lena said immediately. Avoiding a direct encounter with a pack of hyper-raptors was preferable, even if it meant navigating crumbling infrastructure. Aris nodded emphatically in agreement. Maz seemed to concur, leading them down the path marked as unstable. It quickly became apparent why. Sections of the ductwork sagged alarmingly. Rivets had popped, leaving seams gaping. In one place, the entire floor had collapsed into the darkness below, forcing them to edge along a narrow, precarious ledge formed by a remaining support strut. The clicking sounds of the raptors seemed closer here, echoing up from the void below, suggesting they were moving beneath them. As they navigated a particularly unstable section where the metal walls groaned under their weight, Aris suddenly stopped, clutching his head. He stumbled, leaning heavily against the vibrating wall, his eyes squeezed shut. Sabotage code, flickering, Project Chimera, linked, not just storage, control network, he gasped, words tumbling out in disconnected fragments. Someone tried to weaponize the moss, containment protocols, overridden from inside. Aris, Lena grabbed his arm, steadying him. Stay with me, not now. His timing couldn't be worse. The floor beneath them buckled slightly with a sharp metallic screech. Maz looked back, his expression a mixture of fear and frustration. He clicked his tongue impatiently, gesturing for them to hurry. The raptor sounds from below seemed to intensify, drawn perhaps by the noise. Lena hauled Aris forward, forcing him to keep moving despite his disorientation. Just a little further, Doctor, keep moving. They scrambled through the unstable section, reaching a more solid area just as a section of the floor they'd crossed moments before gave way entirely, crashing into the darkness below with a deafening clang. Dust and debris rained down. Below them, a chorus of angry raptor screeches erupted. Too close, Lena breathed, pulling Aris further into the relatively stable duct. They didn't stop, pushing onward, away from the collapse and the agitated predators below. Aris seemed to regain control slowly, the memory fragment receding, leaving him shaken but functional. Their path continued, twisting and turning through the labyrinthine ducts. Maz led them through a section marked with the swirling vortex symbol of a temporal anomaly. Lena felt it as a strange, subtle pressure shift, a brief moment where the air seemed to shimmer, and the sound of their own footsteps momentarily fell out of sync, creating odd echoes. Aris felt it more acutely, groaning and shielding his eyes as faint, ghost-like afterimages flickered at the edge of his vision. Maz navigated the zone quickly, guiding them along one specific side of the duct, seemingly knowing the path least affected by the distortion. Finally, after traversing tunnels that felt increasingly damp, smelling faintly of outside air and rain-soaked concrete, Maz stopped. He pointed ahead. The duct ended about 10 meters further on, opening into a larger space. Filtered, natural light, gray and weak, but unmistakably daylight, seeped in from somewhere beyond. They could hear the faint patter of rain. Maz moved forward cautiously, peering into the larger area. He turned back, a look of confusion and something else, dismay, on his face. He waved them forward slowly. Lena and Aris joined him at the end of the duct. It opened onto a concrete platform overlooking a vast, collapsed section of the facility's outer shell. What must have once been a reinforced wall or perhaps a loading bay area was now a huge pile of rubble, twisted rebar and shattered ferroconcrete, open to the elements. Rain fell steadily onto the debris pile, washing grime down into murky pools. This was the exit Maz had marked on his map, not a door, but a breach, a way out into the overgrown perimeter beyond. Freedom was tantalizingly close. But Maz hadn't stopped them because they'd arrived. He'd stopped because of what lay on the platform between them and the edge leading down to the rubble slope. Fresh tracks littered the damp concrete platform. Large tracks, not the three-toed prints of raptors nor the heavy, distorted footprints of primates. These were different. Canine almost, but far too large, with deep claw marks suggesting immense weight and power. They led from the rubble slope across the platform towards another dark opening, possibly a damaged service tunnel set into the far wall, and leading back out again. Something large, powerful, and predatory was using this breach as an entrance and exit. Echo stalkers, perhaps. The canid descendants adapted to hunt temporal distortions. Worse, near the edge of the platform, partially sheltered by an overhang, lay evidence that the stalkers weren't just passing through. A pile of recently discarded bones, some animal, some disturbingly humanoid, lay scattered amongst shredded remnants of fabric that looked depressingly like standard Chronos research or security uniforms. And lying near the bones, glinting dully in the gray light, was a battered, mud-caked data tablet, identical to the one Aris carried. Maz stared at the scene, his face pale beneath the grime, his hopeful determination visibly crumbling, replaced by profound despair. His escape route, the one he'd perhaps dreamed of for years, wasn't a path to freedom. It was a predator's doorway. As they absorbed the grim reality, a low growl echoed from the dark tunnel opening across the platform. A moment later, a massive, shadowy head emerged, wolf-like but distorted, with eyes that seemed to shimmer, reflecting the gray light in unsettling, non-Euclidean ways. It sniffed the air, its gaze fixing on the three figures silhouetted at the duct opening. The Echo Stalker had returned, and they were standing directly in its path. Chapter 10: The Gray Rain. The Echo Stalker emerged fully from the shadowed tunnel, its form coalescing in the dim, rainy light of the breach. It was a grotesque mockery of canine anatomy, larger than any wolf, with powerful limbs ending in wickedly curved claws that scraped grooves into the concrete platform. Its fur was patchy, revealing sections of tough, gray hide that seemed to shimmer and shift, subtly blurring its outline like heat haze over asphalt. Its head was elongated lupin, but the jaws were unnaturally deep, filled with interlocking teeth designed for shearing bone. The most disturbing feature, however, was its eyes, multifaceted, insectoid orbs set deep within the skull, constantly flickering, reflecting the dreary light not as simple points, but as fractured, overlapping images, hinting at its perception of multiple temporal streams. It moved with a slight, disconcerting jitter, as if its existence wasn't entirely synchronized with the present moment. It fixed its unsettling gaze not on Lena or Maz, but directly on Aris. A low, guttural growl vibrated in its chest, a sound layered with faint, high-pitched whines and clicks like multiple frequencies overlaid. Its head lowered slightly, muscles bunching beneath the shimmering hide. It recognized the scent, the psychic residue, the temporal disruption clinging to Aris from his forced communion with the memory moss. He was an anomaly, a beacon in its skewed sensory world. Aris gasped, stumbling back against the duct wall, his hands flying to his temples. "It's looking through me," he stammered, his voice tight with pain and terror. "Sees the moss echoes. The time shifts." The stalker's proximity was agony, amplifying the psychic fragments still rattling inside his skull. Maz stared at the stalker, then at the rubble slope leading down to the rainy exterior, the promised escape, now guarded by this temporal nightmare. The despair that had washed over him moments before seemed to crystallize into something else, a stark, survivalist decision. Years of solitary evasion had taught him one thing: confrontation with such anomalies was suicide. Evasion, distraction, misdirection. Those were the tools of survival. His eyes darted around the platform, calculating. He spotted a loose bundle of heavy electrical cables dangling from a damaged conduit near the tunnel the stalker had emerged from. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his frantic mind. He met Lena's eyes for a fraction of a second, then pointed sharply towards the rubble slope, then tapped his own chest, then pointed towards the dangling cables. His meaning was clear. "You go. I create diversion." Before Lena could react or argue, Maz moved. He didn't run towards the stalker, but scrambled sideways along the edge of the duct opening, heading towards a pile of loose debris, broken concrete, twisted metal shards, left from the initial collapse of the outer wall. He moved with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. The stalker, momentarily distracted by Maz's sudden movement, shifted its multifaceted gaze towards him. It let out a confused, layered growl. Its primary target was Aris, the temporal beacon, but Maz's frantic energy registered as a secondary, unpredictable variable. "Aris!" Lena yelled, grabbing his arm, trying to snap him out of his sensory overload. "Warnings! Can you see what it's going to do?" Aris squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, pupils dilated, unfocused yet somehow seeing more than the physical world. "Shifting, phasing left, fast," he gasped out, pointing vaguely towards the stalker's flank. Even as he spoke, the stalker's form seemed to blur, its left side becoming momentarily transparent, insubstantial as it initiated a phase shift, preparing for an incredibly fast sideways lunge, likely aiming to flank them and isolate Aris. Lena reacted instantly to the fragmented warning. "Move right, towards the edge." She shoved Aris hard, propelling him away from the predicted phase lunge, towards the top of the rubble slope. She followed, keeping low, her multi-tool held ready. The stalker completed its phase lunge, its physical form solidifying exactly where Aris had been standing moments before. Its jaws snapped shut on empty air. It let out a frustrated snarl, layered with discordant frequencies, its compound eyes swiveling, tracking its prey's new position. Meanwhile, Maz had reached the debris pile. He grabbed a heavy chunk of concrete, hefting it with surprising strength born of desperation. He didn't throw it at the stalker. Instead, he hurled it with all his might towards the dangling electrical cables near the tunnel entrance across the platform. The concrete chunk struck the damaged conduit with a loud clang. Sparks erupted as frayed wires within the bundle made contact. The stalker flinched violently at the sudden noise and flash, its layered growl turning into a high-pitched whine of agitation. Its attention flickered away from Lena and Aris, towards the new, unexpected stimulus. "Now!" Lena screamed, pushing Aris over the edge of the concrete platform. He tumbled onto the steep slope of rubble below, sliding and rolling amidst loose rock and twisted rebar. Lena threw herself after him, trying to control her descent, shielding her head from falling debris. The gray rain instantly soaked them, cold and shocking after the stagnant warmth of the facility's interior. The stalker, momentarily confused by the sparks and noise, whipped its head back towards the escaping humans. It saw them scrambling down the rubble slope. It lowered its head, preparing to bound after them. But Maz wasn't finished. He grabbed another piece of debris, a long shard of twisted rebar. Seeing the stalker about to pursue Lena and Aris, he did the unthinkable. He ran out onto the platform, directly towards the beast, screaming, a raw, ragged, entirely human sound torn from years of enforced silence. He waved the rebar shard wildly. The stalker halted its pursuit, turning its full attention to this smaller, screaming figure challenging it directly. Its shimmering form seemed to ripple with aggression. "Maz, no!" Lena yelled from the rubble slope, looking back in horror. Maz ignored her. He ran closer, jabbing the rebar towards the stalker's face, forcing it to backpedal slightly, surprised by the sheer audacity of the attack. He was buying them time, sacrificing himself. Then from the dark tunnel the first stalker had emerged from, a second head appeared. Another echo stalker, drawn by the commotion. Its multifaceted eyes fixed on the scene, the first stalker, the screaming human, the other two humans scrambling away down the slope. Seeing the second stalker, Maz seemed to realize his suicidal gesture might only delay the inevitable. His expression shifted again. Not despair, not sacrifice, but something else, a final, desperate gamble. He abruptly stopped his attack, threw the rebar shard down with a clatter, and sprinted, not towards the stalkers, but back towards the opening of the duct they had just exited. The first stalker, confused by his sudden retreat, hesitated, then started to follow him back towards the duct. The second stalker began to emerge more fully onto the platform, its attention divided. Lena watched for only a second longer, her mind racing. Maz wasn't just retreating. He was luring the first stalker away from the exit, back into the labyrinth he knew so well. It was still a likely death sentence for him, but it gave them their only chance. "Come on, Aris," she urged, dragging him further down the treacherous slope, away from the platform, away from the stalkers, away from Maz. They half slid, half climbed down the mountain of debris, loose rocks shifting underfoot, sharp edges of metal tearing at their clothes. The rain fell harder, plastering their hair to their faces, obscuring their vision. Behind them, they heard an enraged, layered snarl from the platform, followed by the clang of metal as Maz presumably disappeared back into the ductwork, the first stalker likely crashing after him. The fate of the second stalker, and whether it would pursue them down the slope, remained terrifyingly unknown. They reached the bottom of the rubble pile, stumbling onto uneven, muddy ground choked with unnatural-looking weeds and thorny, invasive vines, the greenhouse's influence bleeding out into the surrounding environment. They didn't stop, pushing through the tangled vegetation, away from the gaping breach in the facility wall. Lena risked a glance back. The concrete and steel structure of the Chronos Greenhouse loomed behind them, immense and silent in the gray rain, a mausoleum of failed ambition and evolving horrors. No stalkers were immediately visible pursuing them down the slope, but the dark opening of the breach felt like a wound, promising that the nightmare wasn't necessarily contained. They pushed forward into the dripping, overgrown woodland that surrounded the complex. The rain was relentless, washing away the grime and stench of the facility, but it couldn't wash away the memories, the trauma. Aris staggered beside Lena, leaning on her heavily, his breathing ragged, his eyes still holding the reflected horrors of the memory moss and the temporal predator. He was alive but profoundly damaged. Lena scanned their surroundings. The woods were unnaturally dense, the trees warped, the undergrowth thick with strange fungi and plants that hinted at temporal contamination spreading beyond the facility walls. Was anywhere truly safe? They found a semblance of shelter beneath a rocky overhang, collapsing onto the damp earth, utterly spent. Aris huddled, shivering, muttering disconnected fragments about sabotage codes and blinking algorithms. Lena checked their meager supplies, her face grim. They were out, but they were exposed, weakened, with no clear destination, and the knowledge that the horrors of Chronos might not be confined to its walls. She looked back towards the facility one last time, half expecting to see Maz emerge, having miraculously evaded the stalker. But there was only the rain, the crumbling concrete, and the suffocating silence of the woods. He was gone, consumed by the labyrinth he had navigated for so long. A silent survivor who found his voice only in his final, desperate act. Lena pulled a damp blanket from her pack, draping it over Aris's shaking shoulders. She sat beside him, pulling her own collar tighter against the cold rain, her multi-tool clutched firmly in her hand. They had survived the Chronos Greenhouse. They had escaped the fauna out of time. But the scars ran deep, the echoes lingered, and the gray rain falling on the contaminated world outside felt less like a cleansing and more like the beginning of a new, more pervasive horror. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just changed location. The end.